You ever have that feeling that something's watching you? I mean, really watching you. Not like someone across the street or a curious animal in the woods. I'm talking about that deep, primal dread that starts as a whisper in your gut and spreads like ice water through your veins. That heavy pressure behind your ears, like the weight of invisible eyes boring into your skull. The goosebumps crawling up your spine in waves, each one carrying the sudden, undeniable knowledge that you are not alone, and that whatever's with you doesn't want to be seen, doesn't want to be known, but wants you to know it's there. Yeah, that feeling. I lived with it for 6 nights straight. 6 nights that stretched like centuries, where every shadow held breath and every silence screamed. My name's Carter. I've been a park ranger in northern Washington for almost 14 years now. 14 years of tracking lost souls through ancient timber, of standing between civilization and the wild heart of America's last untamed places. I've dealt with just about everything. Lost hikers stumbling through hypothermia-induced hallucinations, black bears protecting cubs with murderous intent, forest fires that devour entire ecosystems in hours, drug labs hidden in caves that reek of chemicals and desperation. You name it, I've stared it down and lived to file the report. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I experienced in the Black Pine backcountry 2 summers ago. This wasn't something I could track with broken branches and disturbed earth. This wasn't something I could explain with wildlife behavior patterns or atmospheric phenomena. This wasn't something I could even understand with every survival manual and incident report I'd memorized over the years. And to this day, I still don't know what it was. But I know it was real. I know it was out there. And I know it was watching me with an intelligence that felt ancient, patient, and utterly alien. It started with a missing camper, a solo backpacker named Marcus Holden. 32 years old, experienced hiker from Seattle, the kind who measured his yearly adventures in elevation gained and miles conquered. He filed for a 10-day permit into the deep trails of Black Pine, a zone we barely patrol due to its remoteness and the fact that most sane people avoid it. The old-timers call it the Forgotten Country, where the trees grow too close together and the shadows never quite lift, even at noon. When Marcus didn't return on schedule, didn't call in, didn't extend his permit, didn't show up at any of the check-in stations dispatch sent me in. Standard search and recovery. I'd done dozens of these retrievals before, pulled out everyone from dehydrated day hikers to hypothermic mountaineers. I packed light but thorough. My radio, topographical maps marked with every water source and shelter within 50 miles, my service Glock with 2 extra magazines, and a week's worth of freeze-dried rations that tasted like cardboard but kept you alive. Routine. Or so I thought. I reached the Marcus Creek trailhead late morning, the sun already climbing toward its merciless peak. The air was warm but carried a strange weight to it. Not humidity, not heat distortion, but something else entirely. The sky had this weird haze to it, like smoke from distant fires, but there was no smell of burning wood or grass. No acrid bite in the air. Almost like the atmosphere itself was just off. Contaminated with something I couldn't name. The parking area was empty except for Marcus's Honda Civic, still locked, windows up, a thin film of pine pollen coating the windshield like yellow dust. I checked the interior through the glass. Nothing unusual. Coffee cup in a holder, hiking boots in the back seat, a dog-eared copy of Into the Wild on the dashboard. The kind of scene that should have been reassuring but somehow made my skin crawl instead. The deeper I hiked into the woods, following the narrow dirt path that wound between massive Douglas firs and towering pines, the quieter it got. Not peaceful quiet, like the reverent hush of a cathedral or the gentle silence of fresh snowfall. This was different. Unnatural. Wrong. No birds. That was the first thing that hit me. In 14 years of forest work, I'd never entered a healthy ecosystem without the constant background chorus of songbirds, the territorial calls of ravens, the drumming of woodpeckers against dead bark. Nothing. Even the wind seemed hesitant to move, as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for something to pass. By mid-afternoon, I was deep enough that the canopy above formed an almost solid ceiling, filtering the sunlight into pale green columns that looked more like underwater light than anything terrestrial. The trail itself began to feel wrong. Too straight in some places, too winding in others, as if it couldn't decide where it wanted to go. My GPS flickered intermittently, losing signal for minutes at a time before snapping back to life with coordinates that didn't quite match where I thought I was. I made camp that first night near a small creek, the sound of running water a relief after hours of oppressive silence. But even that felt muted, as if the stream was apologizing for making noise. I set up my tent with practiced efficiency, started a small fire, heated up some chili mac, and tried to shake the feeling that the treeline around my camp was somehow closer than it had been when I'd first arrived. That night, I dreamed of eyes in the darkness. Not animal eyes, those reflect light, shine like coins or marbles when you catch them with flashlight. These were different. Dark, wet, human shape but far too large. And in the dream, they never blinked, never moved, just watched with the patience of something that had been waiting for centuries and was prepared to wait centuries more. It was on day 2 that I found Marcus's camp, or what was left of it. His tent was shredded, but not like a bear had gone at it. I've seen bear damage plenty of times. They tear with claws, creating long, ragged gashes. They bite and shake, leaving puncture marks and slobber. Sometimes they drag entire camps away, scattering gear across acres of forest floor. This looked more methodical, surgical, like it had been cut in several places from the outside with something sharp and precise. The fabric hung in perfect ribbons, each cut exactly 6 inches apart, as if measured. The gear was scattered but not destroyed. His sleeping bag lay 20 feet from the tent, unrolled but clean. His camp stove sat upright on a flat rock, still assembled, fuel canister full. A packet of oatmeal rested against a tree trunk, unopened. His food was completely untouched, not just uneaten, but undisturbed. Even the jerky, which should have attracted every scavenger within miles, sat in its original packaging. No bite marks, no drag marks, no signs that any animal had even investigated. But the strangest part was his boots. They were still lined up by the fire pit, toes pointing toward the cold ashes, laces tucked neatly inside, as if Marcus had just stepped out of them and walked away for a second. The positioning was too perfect, too deliberate, like someone or something had arranged them as a message. But it was his journal that made my blood run cold. I found it wedged between 2 moss-covered rocks near the fire ring, open to a page that had been soaked by rain but was still legible. The ink had run slightly, creating ghostly blue trails down the page, but the words were clear enough. The last entry, dated 3 days before his permit expired, read, "Saw it again last night, watching from the tree line. Same spot as before. Not an animal, I know animals. Too tall to be human, maybe 7 feet, but thin. Unnaturally thin. Doesn't move when I look directly at it, but I can see it shifting in my peripheral vision. Like it's only solid when I'm not paying attention. The worst part isn't seeing it. It's feeling it. I can feel it in my teeth when it looks at me. Like a tuning fork struck against bone. Vibration that goes all the way to my roots. God help me, I think it's been following me since day 1. I think it's been waiting for me. I stood there for a long time, reading that line over and over. Feel it in my teeth. What the hell does that even mean? But even as I asked the question, part of me, some primal, ancestral part that remembered when humans were prey, understood perfectly. I spent an hour searching the area, looking for tracks, disturbed vegetation, anything that might explain what had happened to Marcus. The ground around his camp was soft from recent rain, perfect for preserving footprints. I found Marcus's boot impressions leading to and from the creek, circling the fire pit, pacing back and forth in front of his tent like he'd been agitated. But there were no other human prints. No animal tracks either, which was impossible. Even if some large predator had avoided the immediate campsite, there should have been signs, deer paths, rabbit runs, bird scratches in the dirt. The forest floor around Marcus's camp was completely sterile, as if every living thing had simply decided to walk around this particular patch of earth. That night, I set up my own camp not far from Marcus's destroyed tent. Part of me wanted to get as far away as possible, but my training kicked in. If I was going to find out what happened to Marcus, I needed to stay close, gather more evidence, maybe reconstruct his final days. As night fell, I kept my fire small and my ears open, every ranger instinct I developed over 14 years on high alert. That's when I heard it. It wasn't twigs snapping under the weight of an approaching animal. It wasn't the territorial call of a night predator or the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. It was rhythmic, deliberate, subtle, like something large moving carefully from tree to tree, maintaining a consistent distance from my camp, circling slowly. At first I thought it might be a cougar. They're known to stalk potential prey for hours, staying just outside the ring of firelight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But then it stopped. Completely. No gradual fading of footsteps, no final crunch of leaves, no retreating sounds. Just absolute total silence, as if whatever had been circling had simply vanished into thin air. That's when came the whisper. I swear on everything I hold sacred, on my wife's life and my father's grave, I heard someone whisper my name. Not yell from a distance, not speak in conversational tones. Whisper. Soft and intimate and terrifying, for maybe 10 feet beyond the edge of my firelight. Carter. Just like that. Like whoever or whatever was out there knew me personally. Had been waiting specifically for me. I jumped up so fast I nearly kicked over my camp stove, flashlight in one hand, service weapon in the other, safety off, finger on the trigger. I swept the beam across the tree lean, trying to penetrate the wall of darkness that pressed against my small circle of light. Nothing. Just black pine trunks and impenetrable shadows that seemed to shift and dance just outside my vision. Who's there? I called out, trying to keep my voice steady and authoritative. This is Park Service. Identify yourself. No answer. The woods swallowed my voice like it didn't exist, absorbing the sound so completely that I might as well have been shouting into a vacuum. Even the echo died before it could travel. I stood there for 10 minutes, weapon drawn, flashlight beam dancing from tree to tree, waiting for movement, for an explanation, for anything that would make sense of what I'd heard. But the forest remained silent and still, offering no answers, no comfort, no relief from the certainty that something was out there, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't sleep. Every 15 minutes, I thought I saw movement in the trees, a shape here, a flicker there, always just at the edge of my peripheral vision. But every time I pointed my light directly at the spot, it was just empty branches and bark and shadows that played tricks on exhausted eyes. Day 3 dawned gray and oppressive, the sky hidden behind a ceiling of low clouds that made the forest feel even more closed in and claustrophobic. I backtracked half a mile to higher ground and tried calling into base, following standard protocol for check-ins during extended search operations. No signal. Not even static. My radio, which had worked perfectly at the trailhead, was completely dead. I climbed a ridge, getting another 100 feet of elevation, positioning myself on an exposed rock outcropping where I should have had clear line of sight to the nearest radio tower. Still nothing. The radio's display showed full battery, proper frequency, antenna extended. Every light that should have been green was green. But when I keyed the mic, not even a whisper of static came through the speaker. Which didn't make sense because I'd changed the battery pack the day before I left, as per standard operating procedure. These radios were designed to work in extreme conditions, built to keep rangers connected even in the deepest wilderness. I tried the backup battery I always carried. Also dead. Brand new, still in the package, but when I installed it, the radio remained silent. That was when I started to understand that whatever was happening to me wasn't natural. Wasn't explainable by equipment failure or atmospheric interference or any of the rational explanations I've been clinging to. That night, as I sat by my small fire trying to process the growing list of impossibilities, the whisper came again. Carter. Only this time it was closer. Much closer. Same voice, same tone, but now it seemed to come from just beyond the firelight, maybe 6 feet away. Close enough that if it had been a person, I would have been able to see their breath in the cool night air. And this time, I saw it. Just at the edge of the light, where the orange glow of flames met the absolute blackness of the forest night, a shape resolved itself from the darkness. Tall, impossibly tall, maybe 7 feet, just like Marcus had written. Too thin to be a bear, too still and wrong to be human. Its silhouette was all wrong angles and joints that bent in ways that made my eyes hurt to follow. And its eyes, if that's what they were, reflected the firelight in a dull, wet gleam, like the eyes of something that had been underwater too long. No blinking, no breathing that I could detect. No movement at all except for a slight swaying, as if it were a tree caught in a breeze that I couldn't feel. I stared at it for maybe 5 seconds that felt like 5 hours, my hand frozen on my weapon, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Then, between one heartbeat and the next, it was gone. Just like it had blinked out of existence. No movement, no sound of retreat, no gradual fading into the darkness. One moment it was there, solid and real and terrifying. The next, there was nothing but empty space and the accusatory silence of the woods. I stayed up with my gun on my lap and my flashlight duct taped to the barrel, finger on the trigger, safety off, waiting for it to return. But the rest of the night passed without incident, and when dawn finally came, I was almost surprised to find myself still alive. Next morning, as I packed up my gear with hands that shook more than I cared to admit, I started noticing things that shouldn't have been there. Small things, subtle things, the kind of details that could be dismissed as coincidence or imagination if you weren't paying attention. Twigs arranged in perfect excess across the trail, spaced exactly 10 feet apart, as if marking distance or creating some kind of boundary. When I kicked one apart, it was back in place when I returned 20 minutes later. A ring of rocks around where my tent had been, stones that definitely hadn't been there the night before. They were arranged in a perfect circle, each rock exactly the same size, positioned with mathematical precision. When I counted them, there were 13. When I looked again, there were 12. When I counted a third time, there were 14. A pile of small animal bones stacked neatly by my fire pit. Bird bones, mouse bones, what looked like the delicate skull of a squirrel. They'd been cleaned completely, picked bare, arranged in a small pyramid with a skull on top like some kind of primitive totem. The bones were old, bleached white by sun and weather, but they hadn't been there when I'd made camp. I packed up and hiked hard, trying to make it to the ranger cabin on the south edge of the park. According to my map, it was still 2 days away, but at that point, I was done playing detective. Done trying to solve the mystery of Marcus Holden. Done pretending that what was happening to me had any rational explanation. I just wanted out of those woods, wanted to get back to the world of radio towers and GPS satellites and explanations that made sense. Only, the woods didn't let me leave. Every path I took curved back on itself. Landmarks I passed in the morning showed up again in the afternoon, approached from a different direction, but identical in every detail. I carved my initials into a distinctive white-barked aspen to test my suspicions. For hours later, I passed that same tree, my mark still fresh, sap still bleeding from the cuts I'd made. I was walking in circles, but not random circles, purposeful ones, as if something was controlling my route, herding me like livestock, keeping me contained within a specific area. Something was messing with me. Something with intelligence and intent and a patience that felt older than the forest itself. The realization hit me like ice water in my veins. I wasn't lost. I was being contained, kept, preserved for some purpose I couldn't begin to understand. On night 5, I snapped. The accumulated stress, the sleep deprivation, the growing certainty that I was trapped in something beyond my comprehension. It all came boiling up at once. I shouted into the trees, demanded to know what it wanted, what had happened to Marcus, why it was keeping me here. I cursed and pleaded and threatened, my voice echoing strangely in the still air, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. What do you want? I screamed at the darkness. Show yourself. Face me. Nothing. Just the familiar, oppressive silence that had become the soundtrack to my nightmare. Then, just before dawn, as I lay in my sleeping bag staring at the tent ceiling and trying to convince myself that escape was still possible, I woke to the sound of breathing. Right outside my tent. Deep, slow, and wet, like lungs filled with mud and rotting leaves. The sound was so close, I could feel the vibration through the thin nylon wall, could smell something sweet and corrupt seeping through the fabric, the smell of things that should be buried, things that had been dead too long. I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't even blink. I just listened to that horrible, labored breathing, tried not to think about what would happen if whatever was making it decided to come inside. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the breathing had been, pregnant with possibilities and threats I didn't want to imagine. I waited another hour before crawling out of my tent, heart hammering against my ribs, expecting to see tracks or damage or some evidence of what had been stalking me through the night. But there was nothing. Not even footprints in the soft earth around my campsite. Just a faint scent in the air, like wet stone and old leaves and something else I couldn't identify, but that made my stomach turn. But then I looked up and saw what was hanging in the tree, directly above my tent. Marcus's jacket. The blue and gray windbreaker he'd been wearing in his permit photo, the one that should have been on his body wherever his body was. Still blood-stained from whatever had happened to him. Still ripped and torn. Still damp with something dark and viscous. Still warm. I couldn't make sense of it. The jacket hanging there, swaying slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel, defying every law of physics and logic I'd ever learned. Marcus's jacket wasn't just old and shredded from exposure to the elements. It was fresh. The blood was wet, still seeping at the torn seams, still bright red instead of the brown rust that old blood becomes. The warmth I could feel radiating from it, even from 6 feet below, told me it had been placed there recently. Very recently. Which meant, what? That Marcus was still alive somewhere in these woods. That something, or someone, was dragging his wounded body around the forest, using his belongings like breadcrumbs to lead me deeper into whatever trap had been set. Or worse, that Marcus was dead, had been dead for days, but something was still using him, wearing his clothes, carrying his scent, mimicking his presence. I didn't know which possibility terrified me more. I didn't eat that day. Couldn't eat. My stomach had twisted itself into knots so tight that even the thought of food made me nauseous. I didn't bother boiling water or heating rations or following any of the survival protocols that had been drilled into me during ranger training. I just started walking. No map, no trail, no plan except to maintain a straight line southeast toward where I hoped civilization still existed. I told myself that if I kept going in one direction, ignoring the trails that seemed to curve and twist with minds of their own, eventually I'd hit the Cascade River, or the old fire road that ran along the park boundary, or something that would lead me back to a world that made sense. But by midday, I started recognizing trees I'd passed the day before. Not similar trees, the exact same ones. That distinctive split trunk with the eagle's nest in the crown. The lightning-struck pine with a spiral scar running down its bark. The massive Douglas fir with a hollow at its base where some long-dead creature had made its den. And carved into the bark of an aspen, still fresh, still bleeding sap, C+ arrow pointing east. My own mark, made with my own knife, impossible to mistake. I was walking in circles. Perfect, geometrically precise circles that brought me back to the same landmarks every few hours. No matter which direction I chose, no matter how carefully I navigated by compass and sun. Worse, the sun wasn't moving. I checked my watch obsessively, watched the digital display tick off seconds and minutes and hours. Time was definitely passing, but the light filtering down through the canopy never shifted. Shadows stayed sharp and short, as if stuck in a never-ending noon. The quality of light that should have changed from morning gold to midday white to afternoon amber remained constant, flat, artificial. I started to realize something that made my blood run cold. I wasn't lost. I was being contained, kept in a bubble of space and time that existed apart from the normal world, preserved like a specimen in a jar. Around what my watch insisted was hour 6 of walking in straight lines that became circles. I spotted movement ahead through the trees. Not the tall, impossible shape that had been stalking me. Something smaller. Something that glinted in the unchanging light. A mirror, hanging from a pine branch at eye level, spinning slowly on a length of what looked like fishing line. A small hand mirror, the kind that might have come from a woman's purse or a vintage compact. Its silver rim was tarnished black with age, the glass spider-webbed with cracks that caught and fractured the pale forest light. I don't know why I reached for it. Some part of me hoped it might be a signal, a sign left by another human being, proof that I wasn't completely alone in this nightmare. Maybe it would reflect sunlight, help me signal for rescue. Maybe it would show me something the naked eye couldn't see, reveal whatever was manipulating my perception of this place. But when I looked into the cracked glass, I didn't see my own reflection. I saw Marcus, his face pale as bone, eyes bloodshot and wide with terror, mouth open as if he was screaming silently into a void that wouldn't echo. His hair was matted with something dark. His skin had a gray pallor that spoke of blood loss and shock. But he was alive, definitely alive, though he looked like he was dying by degrees. And behind him, filling the background of the mirror like a living shadow, was that shape. The thing that had been watching me, stalking me, playing with me like a cat with a wounded mouse. But in the mirror, I could see it clearly for the first time. Too many joints, like a marionette designed by someone who had never actually seen human anatomy. Elbows where they shouldn't be, knees bending in directions that made my brain hurt to process. Its face looked like bark that had been wrapped around something alive and writhing, skin that moved independently of any underlying structure. Marcus's mouth moved in the mirror, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. It won't let me die. I dropped the mirror, watched it shatter against a root, silver fragments scattering like scales. Behind me, I heard a branch snap under significant weight. I spun around, flashlight raised even though it was still daylight, expecting to see that impossible shape emerging from the trees. Nothing. But when I turned back to where the mirror had fallen, it was gone. Not just the mirror, the tree it had been hanging from was different now. Thicker. Its bark looked freshly grown, still soft and pale. And as I watched, paralyzed by a fear so complete it felt like drowning, the bark moved. Slightly, almost imperceptibly, like the tree had just taken a breath. That night, if night had any meaning in this place where time seemed negotiable, I didn't sleep. Didn't even sit. I walked in place for hours, legs trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline, until I saw a light through the trees. Not the pale, filtered light of the forest, but warm yellow light. Electric light. The glow of civilization. A cabin. It was mine, the Black Pine Ranger Station where I'd started this whole nightmare a lifetime ago. Exactly as I remembered it, down to the weathered cedar shingles and the hand-painted sign that read U.S. Forest Service Black Pine District. Smoke even rose from the chimney, as if someone had just built a fire, was waiting inside with coffee and explanations and a radio that worked. I ran, legs pumping, heart hammering, every instinct screaming that this was wrong. This was impossible, but maybe, I finally found a way out. I slammed through the door without knocking, desperate for human contact, for the familiar surroundings of my own workspace, and found myself sitting at the desk. Not a reflection in a window or mirror. Not a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. Me. Another version of me, wearing the same clothes I was wearing, bearing the same cuts and scratches I'd accumulated over 6 days in hell. But this other Carter had dried blood on his collar, a 1,000-yard stare that looked through rather than at skin pale as paper. His service weapon lay on the desk beside him, safety off, one round missing from the magazine. The version of me at the desk didn't look up when I entered, didn't acknowledge my presence at all, just sat there, staring at something I couldn't see, and whispered in a voice like wind through dead leaves, "You've already done this." Then everything went black again. When I woke, if waking was the right word for the transition from one nightmare to another, I was back in a clearing. The same clearing where I'd first seen the figure watching me from the tree lean, where Marcus's destroyed camp had been, where everything had started to unravel. Only now the trees had moved. They'd closed in during whatever passed from my unconsciousness, forming a perfect circle around a space maybe 50 feet across. No trail in, no trail out, no gaps between the massive trunks, no sky visible above. Just branches, knit together like the ribs of some vast creature, weaving a ceiling that blocked out the world beyond. The forest had sealed me in, created a natural prison with walls of living wood. There was a fire pit at the center of the circle, not the cold ashes of Marcus's camp, but a fresh fire, flames dancing cheerfully as if someone had just lit the kindling. The wood burned without smoke, the flames cast no heat, and the light they gave off was wrong somehow, too bright and too dim at the same time. And sitting across the fire from where I stood, perfectly still, perfectly positioned, was Marcus. He looked exactly as he had in the mirror, pale, bloodless, eyes wide within terror so complete it had burned out everything else that made him human. But he was solid, real, undeniably present. His clothes were the ones he'd worn in his permit photo, though now they were stained with mud and blood and things I didn't want to identify. His eyes met mine across the dancing flames, but there was no recognition there, no relief or fear or hope. Just a vast, empty acceptance, as if he'd moved beyond human emotion into some space where such things no longer mattered. His lips parted, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute truth. "You're keeping it here," he whispered, each word carefully enunciated, as if he'd been practicing this speech for a very long time. "It needs fear. Tom. You." Then, between one heartbeat and the next, he vanished. Not disappeared, unraveled. His form came apart like smoke caught in a sudden wind, dissolving through cracks in reality I couldn't see, but somehow felt, leaving nothing behind but the smell of wet earth and decay. I screamed, a sound torn from some primitive part of my soul, a howl of rage and terror and despair that should have echoed through the forest for miles. But the sound died immediately, absorbed by the circle of trees as if they were hungry for it. I grabbed a rock and threw it at the fire, expecting to scatter the logs, to break whatever spell or illusion was holding me in this place. The rock passed through the flames without disturbing them, landed somewhere in the darkness beyond, and I heard it bounce off something hollow and metallic. That's when I saw them, dozens of small bones arranged in a perfect circle around the fire pit, all facing outward like sentries. Arm bones, leg bones, pieces of ribcage, scattered teeth that gleamed white in the firelight. Arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometric designs that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't focusing on them. They weren't random. They were deliberate, purposeful, keeping something inside the circle. But I'd broken the circle, disturbed the pattern with my thrown rock. I'd freed it. The branches above began to tremble, a sound like 1,000 wind chimes made of bone. The firelight dimmed and flickered, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. Wind screamed through the trees with voices, dozens of voices, hundreds maybe, all whispering my name in tones that ranged from loving to malevolent to utterly alien. "Carter! Carter! You saw it. Now it sees you. Welcome home, Carter." Then, cutting through the chorus of whispers, silence, complete and absolute, as if the world had stopped breathing. And footsteps, not walking, dragging, like hooves scraping across stone, or claws digging trenches in hard earth. Something impossibly tall, impossibly wrong, began to step into the firelight from the direction where I'd thrown a rock. I couldn't look away, couldn't move. Couldn't even blink. Some primal survival instinct had frozen me in place, the same response that keeps rabbits motionless when hawks circle overhead. It crouched low, bringing its face. Its face was the word for the collection of angles and surfaces that comprised its head, inches from mine. I could smell it now, the sweet corruption of things that should have been buried long ago, the metallic tang of old blood, the green scent of growing things that had never seen sunlight. Its bark skin was alive, moving like water, shifting like it was trying to find the right configuration. Its eyes, too many eyes, placed in impossible positions, focused on me with an intelligence that felt ancient beyond measure. Then it whispered, using my voice, using words I had spoken, mimicking my own inflection with perfect, horrible accuracy. "Let's go home." It leaned in so close I could feel the heat radiating from its skin, but it wasn't the warm heat of a living thing. It was wrong heat, the way rotting compost is warm from the bacteria consuming it from within, or the way roadkill steams in summer sun. Thick, damp heat that carried the promise of dissolution and decay. "Let's go home," it whispered again, still in my voice, and I realized with a horror so complete it felt like drowning that it had been learning from me, studying me, recording every word I'd spoken during my 6 days in its domain, collecting my voice like a trophy. I did the only thing I could think of. I screamed and lunged backward, nearly falling into the fire pit, my body finally breaking free from the paralysis that had held me frozen. My limbs felt heavy, sluggish, like I was moving through syrup or deep water. Every muscle fiber screamed in protest, as if I'd been motionless for hours instead of seconds. The thing didn't follow. Didn't need to. It just watched, head slowly tilting to one side like an owl examining prey. Except this movement was too fluid, too controlled, rotating far past the point where vertebrae should have snapped. Its too many eyes never blinked, never shifted focus, just stare with the patience of something that had been waiting since before humans learned to make fire. Then, as I watched in fascination and terror, it began to unravel. Just like Marcus had. Just like everything else in this place that defied natural law. Its form unwound like smoke caught in wind, its bark skin splitting apart into threads of shadow and mist, individual pieces of its impossible anatomy dissolving and slipping through cracks in reality, seeping into the ground like water into thirsty earth. Within seconds, there was nothing left but empty space and the lingering smell of wet stone and old graves. I stood in that clearing for what felt like hours, waiting for it to return, waiting for the next phase of whatever game it was playing with my sanity. My hands shook uncontrollably. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat, in my fingertips, in my temples. Every shadow seemed to writhe with hidden movement. Every whisper of wind through the branches carried threats and languages I'd never heard. But slowly, gradually, something began to change. The trees that had formed the walls of my prison started to pull back. Branches that had been knitted together like ribs began to separate, gaps appearing between trunks that had been pressed together like prison bars. Light trickled in, not the flat, artificial illumination that had plagued me for days, but real light, natural light, the kind that changes with the passage of time and the movement of clouds across an actual sky. Dull, overcast daylight filtered through the widening gaps, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could see beyond the immediate circle of my imprisonment. Beyond the trees, I caught glimpses of familiar landmarks, the ridge I'd climbed on day 3, the creek where I'd found Marcus's camp, the distinctive rock formation that marked the halfway point to the ranger station. I ran. Didn't think about it, didn't analyze whether this might be another trick, another layer of the psychological maze I'd been trapped in. I just ran, crashing through undergrowth, stumbling over roots and fallen logs, driven by a desperate need to put distance between myself and that clearing where reality bent like heated metal. And this time, this one miraculous time, the trail held. The path stayed straight where it should be straight, curved where my memory said it should curve. Landmarks appeared in the correct sequence, at the proper distances. My compass pointed steadily north. My watch showed time passing in normal increments, and overhead, the sun actually moved across the sky like it was supposed to. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs gave out, until I collapsed in a heap of exhaustion and relief at the edge of the tree line, gasping like a drowning man who'd finally reached the surface. I stumbled out of the forest at dusk, legs trembling with exhaustion, uniform torn and filthy, collapsing in the gravel parking lot next to the real Black Pine Ranger station. Not the impossible duplicate I'd found in the woods, but the actual building where I'd started this nightmare a lifetime ago. My knees were bloodied from falls I didn't remember taking. My pack was half torn, straps barely holding together, and my boots were soaked in something dark and viscous that I didn't want to inspect too closely. A hiker found me there 20 minutes later, a middle-aged woman from Portland who'd been coming back from a day hike when she spotted me babbling incoherently in the parking lot, talking to empty air about mirrors and whispers and things that watched from shadows. She later told the rescue team that I'd been having a conversation with someone she couldn't see, pleading with invisible presences to let me go home, promising I'd never come back to their woods. I came to in the Cascade Regional Hospital 2 days later, for drip in my arm, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like mechanical insects, my wife Sarah holding my hand with a kind of desperate grip that said she'd been afraid she might never get the chance to touch me again. The antiseptic smell of the hospital was the most beautiful thing I'd ever experienced, clean, artificial, completely free of the organic corruption that had filled my nostrils for 6 days. I tried to explain what happened, what I'd seen and heard and experienced in those woods. The words came out in fragments, disconnected pieces of a puzzle that made perfect sense to me, but sounded like the ravings of someone whose mind had snapped under pressure. I told them about the figure that watched from the trees, about Marcus appearing and disappearing like smoke, about the mirrors that showed impossible reflections, and the voices that called my name from the darkness. The doctors nodded with professional sympathy and made notes about acute stress reaction, sleep deprivation, possible hallucinations brought on by dehydration and exhaustion. The state police investigators were more interested in facts. I had been found 5 miles from the Cascade River Fire Road, nowhere near Marcus Holden's last known location. There was no clearing surrounded by impassable trees, no destroyed campsite, no evidence of the supernatural prison I described in such vivid detail. They did find Marcus's journal, though. What was left of it? It was discovered lodged in a hollow cedar stump not far from where the hiker had found me, torn and half-burned, pages scattered by wind and weather. Most of it was illegible, destroyed by rain and time, but they were able to recover several pages, including what appeared to be his final entries. The page they showed me in the hospital was water-damaged, the ink run and faded, but I could still make out the last words Marcus had written. Day 7, it's in my dreams now. Even when I close my eyes, I can feel it watching. The forest doesn't forget. If you hear it call your name, if you see it in the shadows, you belong to it. It won't let you leave. It won't let you die. It just keeps you, forever and ever, walking in circles, feeding it fear. God help whoever comes looking for me. Below that, in handwriting so shaky it looked like it had been written during an earthquake. The forest doesn't forget. If you hear it, you belong to it. I stared at those words for a long time, remembering the voice that had whispered my name from the darkness, the intelligence behind those unblinking eyes, the patient malevolence that had toyed with me like a cat with a mouse. Marcus had known what was happening to him, had understood that he was trapped in something beyond human comprehension, and he tried to warn whoever came after him. But his warning had come too late for me. I'd already heard it, already seen it, already belonged to it, in whatever way such things worked. I didn't go back to work. Couldn't go back. How do you explain to your supervisor that you can no longer enter certain forests because something lives there that defies every natural law you've ever learned? How do you tell your colleagues that there are places in the wilderness where reality works differently, where time moves in circles and shadows have a mind of their own? I quit the service a week after I was released from the hospital. Took early retirement, cashed out my pension, and moved Sarah and myself as far from Black Pine as I could manage. We bought a house in Phoenix, surrounded by concrete and asphalt and the blessed noise of civilization. No trees for miles. No shadows deep enough to hide impossible things. No silence profound enough for whispers to carry. I thought maybe I'd escaped. Maybe whatever had claimed me in those woods was bound to its territory, unable to follow me into the world of streetlights and traffic and 10 million people living their lives in blissful ignorance of what lurked in the deep places of the world. For 6 months, I almost believed I was free. Last Tuesday, Sarah called me from the living room around midnight, her voice tight with the kind of fear that cuts through sleep like a blade. "Carter," she whispered, and just the way she said my name made my blood run cold. "There's someone outside. He's standing by the fence line." I knew before I looked. Some part of me that had never left those woods, that would always belong to whatever dwelt in the shadows between the trees, recognized the quality of stillness in the air, the weight of invisible attention focused like a laser on our little bubble of suburban safety. I walked to the window on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, pulled back the curtain with fingers that trembled despite every effort to remain calm. It wasn't a man standing at the edge of our property. It was a shape. The shape, tall and wrong and impossible, somehow managing to look both solid and insubstantial at the same time. It stood perfectly motionless beneath the streetlight, casting no shadow despite the artificial illumination, its too many joints and bark skin, just as I remember from my nightmares. As I watched, paralyzed by a terror so complete it felt like dying, it slowly turned what might have been its head in my direction. Those wet, unblinking eyes found mine through the glass, through the walls, through the pathetic barriers of stucco and drywall that I'd thought might protect me. And just before it melted back into the darkness like smoke dispersing on wind, fading into nothingness as if it had never been there at all, I heard it again, through the double-paned windows, through the insulation, through the white noise of air conditioning and the distant hum of traffic. "Carter." My name, whispered with the same intimate familiarity it had used in the woods, spoken in my own voice with perfect, horrible accuracy. The next morning, I checked our backyard with the obsessive thoroughness of a man whose sanity depended on finding evidence that what he'd experienced was real. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as I examined every inch of the fence line, every blade of grass, every stone in our carefully maintained xeriscaped garden. Near the back fence, exactly where the thing had been standing, I found them arranged in the red desert dirt. 2 small twigs, placed with mathematical precision to form a perfect X, just like the markers I'd found on the trails in Black Pine, just like the signs that something vast and patient and utterly alien had left to mark its territory, to claim what belonged to it. I stared at those twigs for a long time, understanding finally that distance meant nothing to the thing that had marked me. Geography was irrelevant. The concrete and steel and artificial light of the city offered no protection from something that existed partially outside the normal rules of space and time. I belonged to it now. Had belonged to it from the moment I'd heard my name whispered in the darkness of the Black Pine backcountry. And no matter where I ran, no matter how far I traveled from those ancient woods, it would always be able to find me. Because the forest doesn't forget, and neither does what lives in its deepest shadows. Some forest stories are about survival, about humans overcoming the indifferent cruelty of nature through courage and skill and determination. Some are about monsters, about ancient things that hunt in the darkness, creatures that can be fought and killed and defeated if you're brave enough and smart enough and lucky enough. But some stories, the worst ones, the ones that stay with you long after you've finished reading them, are about memory. About places that remember you, that notice you, that mark you as belonging to them in ways that transcend physical presence. About intelligences so alien and patient that they can wait decades, centuries, for the right moment to collect what they consider theirs. I didn't die out there in the Black Pine backcountry. Death would have been simpler, cleaner, more honest than what actually happened to me. Instead, something far worse occurred. I was changed. Marked. A piece of my soul was claimed by something that has no name in any human language, something that exists in the spaces between what we know and what we fear to discover. Marcus Holden learned this truth before I did. Tried to warn me with his final journal entry, tried to pass along the knowledge that would have saved me if I'd been smart enough to understand it. But by then it was already too late. I'd already heard my name whispered in the darkness, already seen those unblinking eyes reflecting firelight, already belonged to it body and soul for the rest of whatever passes for my natural life. If you ever find yourself hiking in the Black Pine backcountry, if you ever feel the silence grow too deep, the shadows stretch too long, the weight of invisible attention settling on your shoulders like a lead blanket, remember this story. Remember Marcus's warning and my testimony. Don't ignore the silence when it becomes too profound, too complete, too wrong for a healthy ecosystem. Don't follow trails that curve back on themselves, that lead you in perfect circles, that bring you past landmarks you've already seen. Don't trust mirrors that show you reflections that aren't your own. And if you hear your name whispered from the darkness, even once, even softly, don't respond. Don't run. Don't breathe. Just wake up. Fight your way back to consciousness, back to the world of electric lights and radio signals and explanations that make sense. Because if you acknowledge what's calling to you, if you let it know that you can hear it and see it and feel it watching, it'll follow you home. And once it has your scent, once it's marked you as belonging to its domain, there's nowhere you can run that it won't eventually find you. No city bright enough, no house secure enough, no distance great enough to break the connection that binds you to something older and more patient than human civilization. The forest doesn't forget, and neither does what lives in its deepest, darkest places. Authors note, this account was found among the personal effects of Carter Mitchell, former U.S. Forest Service ranger, following his disappearance from his Phoenix home in March 2024. His wife reported that he had gone to bed normally, but was missing from their bedroom when she woke the next morning. The only signs of disturbance were the front door standing open and two small twigs arranged in an X pattern on their doorstep. He has not been seen since. The Black Pine backcountry remains closed to public access pending ongoing investigation. There's a crack in the earth where no light touches. Even at noon, even in summer, even with a full sun blazing overhead, Split Rock Canyon stays cold and dark. It's not a tourist spot, not even marked on most of the maps we hand out. Too remote, too steep, and according to locals, too dangerous. I used to laugh that off. Thought it was just superstition, old lumberjack legends, settler ghost stories, cryptid nonsense. The kind of tales that grow legs in bars after the third whiskey, when men with calloused hands speak in hushed tones about things they swear they saw but can never quite describe. That was before I saw what was down there, before I lost my partner, before I realized the land itself has a heartbeat, and it's been counting down to something for longer than human memory can reach. My name's Mason. I've worked for the Forest Service for 10 years. 2 of those as lead ranger out near the Bitterroot Divide. Rugged territory. The kind of place where cell reception dies like a strangled animal. Maps lie with the confidence of politicians, and if something goes wrong, help is days away. Maybe weeks, if the weather turns. I've pulled bodies out of ravines. I've tracked lost hikers through blizzards that could strip the flesh from your bones. I've seen what exposure does to a man's mind, how it makes him see things that aren't there, hear voices in the wind that sound like salvation but lead only to deeper wilderness. But what I found under Split Rock wasn't hallucination. It wasn't exposure. It was something that had been waiting. Last September, we got a report of smoke deep inside the northern ridges. Not wildfire smoke. I know that smell, acrid and urgent. This was campfire smoke, the lazy curl of burning pine and oak. Illegal that time of year, especially in that zone. Fire restrictions had been in place since July, and the forest was dry as old bones. Dispatch couldn't get a lock on the signal, so I took a junior ranger, Kelso, and we hiked in blind. 5 days of rations, thermal gear, satellite phone, standard survival kit, everything by the book because the wilderness doesn't forgive shortcuts. What we found wasn't just a camp. It wasn't even a person. It was something else, something old, so old that the trees themselves seemed to lean away from it, their roots growing in patterns that spoke of ancient avoidance, of genetic memory warning them to give this place a wide berth. Something that didn't want to be found, but had been calling to us anyway, sending smoke signals like a beacon for those foolish enough to answer. And now, a year later, I still dream about what's under Split Rock. The dreams come in waves, always at 3:17 a.m., always with the smell of wet stone and something else, something organic and wrong. In those dreams, I hear Kelso screaming from a hole so deep no light escapes, calling my name in a voice that's not his anymore, but something wearing his vocal cords like an ill-fitting mask. You want to hear it? Fine. But if you live near Bitterroot, maybe close your windows first. Draw the curtains. Check the locks. Because some stories, once told, have a way of seeping into the world like groundwater, carrying things with them that were better left buried. We started early, the kind of cold morning where your breath fogs sideways and the ground crunches under your boots like broken glass. It was late September, but up here, that already means frost. The mercury had dropped to 26 degrees overnight, and ice crystals decorated every surface like nature's warning system. The air felt wrong. Thin, but heavy at the same time. The kind of pressure that tells your instinct something's waiting ahead, something that changes the very composition of the atmosphere just by existing. My ears popped twice during the first hour of hiking, though we weren't climbing that much elevation. We followed an unmarked trail off Split Rock Ridge, if you could call it a trail. More like a suggestion worn into the earth by something that didn't quite walk the way humans do. The path meandered in ways that defied logic, sometimes doubling back on itself for no apparent reason, sometimes leading directly toward cliff faces before veering away at the last possible moment. The forest thickened fast, twisted pines growing so close together they creaked when the wind moved through them, their branches interlocked like arthritic fingers. Ancient spruces rose like cathedral pillars, their trunks scarred with deep gouges that looked almost deliberate. We hiked for 4 hours, descending steep switchbacks that seemed to spiral deeper than the topography should have allowed, until the terrain turned jagged and unforgiving. The silence was the first thing I noticed. No birds, no animal tracks. Even the moss looked dry and brittle, clinging to the bark like scabs. The usual forest sounds, the chittering of squirrels, the distant drumming of woodpeckers, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, were completely absent. It was as if we'd crossed some invisible boundary into a dead zone where life had simply given up. Kelso noticed it, too. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his hand drifting to the bare spray on his belt. "This place gives me the creeps," he muttered, his voice unnaturally loud in the silence. I nodded, but didn't say what I was thinking, that the forest wasn't just quiet. It was listening. Then we saw it, the smoke. Just a thin wisp curling up between two granite outcrops, pale against the darker stone like a ghost trying to take shape. Too small for a wildfire, too controlled for an accident. But it was there, definite and deliberate. Still fresh, carrying the sweet scent of burning hardwood mixed with something else, something that made my stomach turn without knowing why. Kelso and I exchanged a look. He was only 23, barely 2 seasons in, but he was sharp. Sharp enough to see the concern in my eyes, the way my hand had unconsciously moved to my radio. He nodded, understanding without words that we were walking into something that didn't fit the normal parameters of our job. We pressed forward, following the smoke's origin through a maze of granite pillars that rose from the earth like the ribs of some massive, buried creature. The camp was in a natural bowl of stone, maybe 40 feet wide, surrounded on all sides by sharp canyon walls that rose straight up like the sides of a well. The geometry was wrong, too perfect, too deliberately formed to be entirely natural. The fire was dead, reduced to a pile of ash and ember that glowed faintly in the shadow of the surrounding rocks. No tent, no pack, no sign of human habitation except for a small ring of blackened stones arranged in a pattern that hurt to look at directly, and a notebook. Lying wide open in the dirt beside the dead fire, its pages fluttering in a breeze that shouldn't have existed in this sheltered space. I picked it up with growing unease. The pages were warped with moisture, the ink slightly smeared but still legible. Handwriting, blocky, deliberate, written with a kind of pressure that spoke of urgency or fear. September 13th followed the whispers again. They're coming from beneath the rock, below the ridge, deeper each night. Something's alive down there. Something that knows I'm listening. I flipped the page. September 14th found the entrance. The crack speaks in languages older than words. The stone is warm to the touch, pulse like a heartbeat. Can't leave, won't leave, need to understand. Another page. September 15th, it's not speaking to me. It's speaking through me. The words come out of my mouth, but they're not mine. Sarah, if you find this, don't come looking. Some doors shouldn't be opened. Some things are buried for good reason. Kelso leaned over my shoulder, his breathing shallow and quick. What the hell does that mean? Then we both heard it. Click. Not mechanical, organic. Like bone tapping stone in a rhythm that almost sounded like Morse code. Deliberate. Patient. Waiting. We spun around, hands instinctively reaching for our equipment. Nothing. But the air felt heavier now, thick with the weight of observation. Like the earth itself was leaning in, pressing close to examine these new arrivals to its secret chamber. Then we saw the crack. At the far end of the bowl was a split in the rock that shouldn't have existed. Maybe 2 feet wide at its widest point, tapering to a narrow gash that disappeared into darkness, so complete it seemed to absorb light rather than simply lacking it. Deep, impossibly deep. It looked like a lightning bolt had cracked the granite from above, but the stone wasn't shattered. It was peeled, the edges smooth and deliberate, like something had pushed upward from below with incredible, patient force. The crack ran for about 15 feet along the base of the canyon wall, but it was the depth that made my chest tighten. This wasn't a surface fissure or a weathering crack. This was a wound that went down to the bones of the earth itself. Kelso pulled out his headlamp, the LED beam cutting through the late afternoon shadows. He shined it into the crack, leaning forward with the careless curiosity of youth. "It goes down forever," he said, his voice carrying a note of awe that I didn't like. "I can't even see the bottom. The light just stops." I leaned in beside him, heart pounding with a rhythm that seemed to match something I could feel through the soles of my boots. The light got swallowed by the black, disappearing without reflection or echo, as if the darkness itself was hungry. The walls of the crack were smooth, almost polished, marked with the same kind of spiral patterns I'd seen carved into ancient petroglyphs. But these weren't carved. They were pressed into the stone, as if the rock had been soft when they were made, yielding like clay to something with a patience to work for centuries. Then we both heard it, a voice. "Help." It echoed upward from the depths, too faint to pinpoint but clear enough to understand. Human. Desperate. The kind of cry that reaches into your chest and squeezes your heart with primal recognition. "Help me." Kelso looked at me, his eyes wide in the reflected glow of his headlamp. "That's a person. Someone's down there." I wanted to agree. Every instinct I had as a ranger, as a human being, screamed at me to respond to that plea. But something about that voice chilled me to the marrow. It was just a little too clear for the distance it seemed to travel. No distortion from echo. No breathlessness from pain or fear. Just mimicry. Like a recording played back through speakers made of stone and darkness. It could be a trap, I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. Or echo from further off. Sound plays tricks and formations like this. Let's mark the location and call to her when we get a line out. But Kelso was already lowering his backpack to the ground, his movements quick and decisive. "I'm going in. Someone needs help. Don't." That's an order. The words came out sharper than I intended, carrying all the authority I could muster. But something in my tone made us both pause, made us acknowledge that this wasn't just a judgment call about safety protocols. He stopped. but not because of me. Something was moving inside the crack. Not one thing, many. A ripple of movement that suggested multiple forms, each one wrong in a different way. Like a nest of black limbs scraping upward against the stone, testing the boundaries of their prison. We stepped back instinctively as the crack gave off a sound I still hear in my nightmares. The sound of teeth grinding against stone, a bone scraping bone, of things that had been trapped for too long finally sensing freedom. The voice came again. Same tone, same rhythm, same desperate plea. Help me. Kelso raised his light again, the beam shaking slightly in his grip. And that's when we saw it. The thing inside the crack wasn't speaking. It had no mouth, no throat, no organic structure capable of producing human speech. It was imitating sound, playing it back like a broken recorder that had learned to scream by listening to the dying. Kelso should have run. I should have stopped him. But there's something about the crack, about that voice, that pulls at you with a gravity deeper than physics. I felt fear before. Real gut-level fear that floods your system with adrenaline and sends you running on pure instinct. But this wasn't that. This was confusion wrapped in dread, a magnetic attraction that bypassed rational thought entirely. Your brain knows something's wrong, registers danger at every level, but your body just wants to see more, to understand, to step closer to the edge and peer into the abyss that's peering back. The crack seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm, a thrumming that I felt in my teeth, in the hollow spaces behind my eyes. The air around it shimmered like heat waves, though the temperature was dropping as the sun moved lower behind the canyon walls. Kelso slid down first, despite my protests. There wasn't a rope, so he braced himself between the narrow walls, his boots finding purchase on the spiral indentations that marked the stone like a twisted ladder designed for something with too many joints. I tried calling it in on the sat phone, but there was nothing, just static that slowly resolved into a pattern that almost sounded like whispers, and then a faint voice, not from the speaker, but from somewhere behind my left ear. Stay with him. I nearly dropped the phone. The voice was mine. My own voice, speaking words I hadn't said, offering advice I didn't want to follow. I shouted down into the crack instead, my voice cracking with strain. Kelso, stop. We don't know how deep it goes. We don't have proper equipment. His voice echoed back up, distorted by distance and stone, but still recognizably excited. I can see a ledge. There's carvings down here, Mason. Old ones. Really old. He wasn't lying. I could see the faint glow of his headlamp maybe 20 feet down, illuminating patches of worked stone that definitely weren't natural formations. Against every protocol I'd ever learned, every survival instinct I'd ever trusted, I followed him down. The walls widened as I descended, forming a hidden cavern that had been invisible from above. Natural, but wrong in every way that mattered. Everything felt like it had been shaped, guided by intelligence rather than random geological processes. The stone was warm to the touch, with a texture that was almost organic, almost alive. Geometric lines spiraled across the walls in patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Spirals that shimmered in the light like oil on water, creating optical illusions that made my inner ear revolt and my balance waver. And symbols, deep ancient ones carved into every available surface, carved into the granite like scars that had never healed. None I recognized from any Native American petroglyphs or historical artifacts. These were older, deeper, the kind of marks that suggested the presence of intelligence so alien that human minds could only process them as abstractions, as nightmares given form. Kelso stood frozen near one wall, his headlamp aimed at a pattern etched into the floor of the cavern. His posture was wrong, too, rigid, like he was holding his breath or trying not to move at all. The pattern looked like a fossil, a massive ribcage etched into the rock with mathematical precision. Not embedded, not petrified. Too symmetrical to be natural, too large to belong to any creature that had ever walked the earth. The ribs stretched across nearly the entire floor of the chamber, curving inward toward a central point where something else was carved, something that hurt to look at directly, that made my vision blur and my sinuses ache. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, though even whispers seemed too loud in this place, too violating of whatever ancient silence we disturbed. Kelso didn't answer immediately. When he finally turned to look at me, I saw that his pupils were completely dilated, black circles that reflected my headlamp beam like polished obsidian. He turned slowly, his movements mechanical and strange. "It's still alive." Then the floor trembled beneath our feet, and I realized that what I'd taken for carved stone was something else entirely. At first, I thought it was an earthquake. The Pacific Northwest sits on active fault lines, and tremors aren't uncommon in the high country. But this shaking was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It didn't shake or rattle the way seismic activity does. It pulsed, like the ground itself had a heartbeat that was slowly waking up, gradually increasing its tempo as circulation returned to long-dormant extremities. The air inside the crack changed, got wet and thick, almost sticky, like the atmosphere inside a lung or some other internal organ. Our lights flickered in unison, the LED beams wavering as if the darkness was fighting back, trying to reclaim its territory. My chest tightened, pressure building behind my ribs like something was pressing on my lungs from the inside. The temperature rose by what felt like 10 degrees in as many seconds. Sweat began beading on my forehead despite the cool September air above, and I could smell something new in the humid atmosphere, something organic and wrong, like flowers rotting in standing water. Kelso stepped forward, his movements still mechanical and wrong, as if he was sleepwalking or being controlled by something that didn't quite understand how human joints were supposed to work. And then the wall beside him breathed. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. The stone expanded and contracted like living tissue, the carvings bulging outward as if there was muscle and sinew beneath the granite surface. One of the spirals began to spin, not literally moving, but creating the optical illusion of rotation that made my inner ears scream warnings about vertigo and disorientation. The spiral pulled at my vision like a whirlpool, dragging my attention deeper into its center, where something waited that I didn't want to see but couldn't look away from. The pattern seemed to extend beyond the physical surface of the stone, reaching into dimensions that my mind could only process as pain and nausea. Then came the sound. Not the mimic voice we'd heard from above. Something deeper, older. A vibration that seemed to originate from the Earth's core itself, rising through layers of rock and time to finally break the surface in this hidden chamber. It wasn't words in any language I recognized. It wasn't communication in any sense that human minds could process. It was presence, raw, alien consciousness pressing against the inside of my skull like water pressure at the bottom of the ocean. Under. The concept hit my brain like a physical blow, carrying meaning that bypassed language entirely. Images flooded my mind, vast networks of caverns extending deeper than the deepest mines, older than the oldest fossils. Things moving in that darkness that had never seen light, never needed to. Things that had been dreaming while continents drifted and ice ages came and went. Kelso dropped to his knees, clutching his temples with both hands, his headlamp spinning wild patterns across the breathing walls. "It wants us to go deeper," he gasped, his voice strained and distant. "It's been waiting so long, so hungry. It wants to show us things that humans aren't supposed to see." "No." I grabbed his shoulder, felt the unnatural heat radiating from his skin through his jacket. "We're getting out of here now. This is beyond anything we're equipped to handle." But he didn't move. Couldn't move. The presence that had invaded this space was holding him in place with gravity that operated on consciousness rather than mass. His mouth opened, and something came out that wasn't his voice. A sound high-pitched and unnatural, like a flute made of bone and sinew. It echoed around the chamber with harmonics that shouldn't have been possible, creating overtones that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The carvings responded to the sound, glowing with faint orange lines that pulsed in rhythm with the underground heartbeat I could feel through my boots. That's when I understood with horrible clarity. This wasn't a cave we discovered. It was a mouth. And we were already inside, being tasted by something that had been patient enough to wait centuries for its next meal. I tried dragging Kelso toward the crack we descended through, but the walls were moving subtly, like stone plates grinding behind the surface with geological patience. The light from our headlamps revealed textures that hadn't been there moments before, organic patterns that suggested we were inside something alive, something vast enough that two humans weren't even recognizable as foreign objects in its system. The crack we climbed down was narrowing. What had been a 2-foot gap at its widest point was now barely shoulder width, the smooth edges grinding together with the sound of tectonic plates in slow motion. Stone groaned and settled around us, not collapsing or crushing, but closing deliberately, purposefully. Not fast enough to panic, but just fast enough to make the inevitability clear. The air grew thicker, more humid, carrying scents that had no business existing in underground rock formations. Organic decay. Salt water. Something that might have been ozone or might have been fierce sweat. The breathing of the walls became more pronounced, more rhythmic, as if whatever we were inside was beginning to wake up fully after a long dormancy. Kelso suddenly dug in his heels, his body going rigid with resistance when I tried to pull him toward the narrowing exit. "We belong here," he said, his voice flat and emotionless, like someone reciting a memory that didn't belong to them. "It's been calling to us for so long. We're finally home." "Shut up," I snapped, panic making my voice sharp. "We're leaving. Now." "You don't get it," he said, turning to face me with eyes that reflected too much light, pupils still dilated to black circles that seemed to extend deeper into his skull than should have been possible. "It's not waking up. It was never asleep. It's been dreaming us this whole time." The words hit me like physical blows, carrying implications that my conscious mind refused to process, but that something deeper, more primitive, understood with perfect clarity. Then he shoved me hard. I fell backward into the narrowing passage, slamming into the smooth stone wall with enough force to split my lip and send stars across my vision. Blood filled my mouth, copper and salt that seemed to make the organic smell in the air stronger, more urgent. I scrambled up, ignoring the pain in my elbow where it had struck stone, just in time to see the crack seal completely, like it had never been there. Like the stone had flowed together like liquid, erasing all evidence of the opening that had led us into this underground hell. Kelso was gone. No sound, no scream, no final plea for help. Just stone. Solid, ancient, unmarked granite that showed no sign of ever having been disturbed. And the echo of that bone flute sound trailing off into silence, followed by something that might have been laughter, or might have been the settling of rock that had finally achieved the configuration it had been seeking for millennia. I don't remember the climb out. One moment, I was pounding my fists on the stone wall where Kelso had disappeared, screaming his name until my throat was raw and my knuckles were bloody. The next moment, I was above the canyon bowl, on my hands and knees in the twisted undergrowth, vomiting everything in my stomach plus things that seemed to come from deeper inside me, bile and blood and something that tasted like metal and electricity. I must have blacked out, maybe for minutes, maybe for hours. The sun had moved, casting different shadows through the interlocked pine branches. My radio was dead, the display dark and unresponsive despite a full battery when we'd started the descent. My GPS read 0.0 coordinates, as if I'd somehow moved beyond the reach of satellites, beyond the mathematical certainty of our planetary positioning system. The trees around me weren't the same ones I remembered from our descent. Everything was too quiet, wrapped in a silence so complete it felt aggressive. No wind stirring the branches. No birds calling from the canopy. No insects buzzing or small animals rustling through the underbrush. Like the air itself had been vacuum sealed, drained of all the small sounds that make a forest feel alive. Even my own breathing seemed muffled, dampened by an atmosphere that absorbed sound rather than carrying it. When I tried to call Kelso's name, my voice came out as barely a whisper, swallowed by the oppressive quiet before it could travel more than a few feet. The wrongness of it sent adrenaline flooding through my system, cutting through the disorientation and shock that had followed my escape from the underground chamber. This wasn't natural. This wasn't normal forest behavior, even in the deepest wilderness. Something had changed in the world above while I was trapped below, some fundamental alteration in the way reality operated in this place. I ran. Didn't stop to gather my equipment or check my bearings or follow any of the survival protocols that had been drilled into me through years of training. I just ran, crashing through undergrowth that seemed to grab at my clothes and boots, stumbling over routes that felt too regular, too deliberately placed to be entirely natural. Behind me, I could feel the canyon bowl like a wound in the earth, a mouth that had finally been fed but was still hungry, still pulling at my consciousness with a gravity that operated on something deeper than physics. The urge to turn around, to go back and throw myself into that crack, was almost overwhelming. Part of me, a part that was growing stronger with each step away from the canyon, whispered that I belonged down there, that the surface world was just an illusion, that my real life was waiting in the breathing darkness beneath the stone. I ran harder, focusing on the pain in my legs and the burning in my lungs, using physical sensation to anchor myself to the world above. But even as I fled, I could feel something following me through the forest. Not physically. There were no footsteps, no breaking branches or rustling leaves, but a presence patient and vast, keeping pace with my panicked flight through the woods. It followed me all the way back to the ranger station, 30 miles of wilderness that I covered in a fugue state of terror-fueled endurance. I made it back the next morning, arriving at dawn with frostbites starting on my fingers, severe dehydration, blood loss from dozens of cuts and scrapes, and a core body temperature low enough to trigger hypothermia protocols. But I made it. Against all odds, against the thing that had tried to keep me in its underground domain, I made it back to the world of radios and vehicles and electric lights and all the small human things that keep the darkness at bay. When I told command what had happened, they listened with a kind of patient attention that meant they were already formulating their official report. Missing person in hazardous terrain. Probable fall into unmapped cavern system. Surviving ranger suffering from exposure-induced hallucinations and trauma-related dissociation. They sent a team anyway, 3 experienced search and rescue specialists with climbing equipment and ground-penetrating radar. I watched them load their gear into the helicopter, wanted to warn them about what they might find, but the words wouldn't come. How do you explain that the earth itself is alive and hungry? How do you describe something that exists in the spaces between what's real and what's possible? 3 days later, they radioed back. No sign of Kelso. No crack in the rock formation. No carvings or unusual geological features. Just untouched granite and lichen, weathered stone that showed no evidence of recent disturbance or human presence. The bowl-shaped canyon they described didn't match my memory of the place. According to their report, it was just a natural depression in the stone, maybe 15 feet across, with no vertical walls or enclosed feeling. The kind of unremarkable geological feature that wouldn't rate a second glance from experienced searchers. They brought back photographs. Digital images of ordinary rock formations, wind-carved stone, scattered pine needles, and mountain debris. Nothing that looked like the carved chamber I remembered. Nothing that suggested the presence of intelligence older than human civilization. They said I'd hallucinated the whole thing. Trauma-induced breakdown triggered by Kelso's accidental death in a fall I probably witnessed but couldn't psychologically process. The mind creates elaborate fantasies to protect itself from unbearable reality, they explained. Ancient monsters and breathing stone were easier for my subconscious to accept than the simple, terrible fact that my partner had died and I'd been powerless to save him. I was placed on mandatory leave and quietly shuffled out of field duty. Psychological evaluation. Counseling sessions. Medication that made everything feel wrapped in cotton but didn't stop the dreams. Early retirement with full benefits, and a notation in my file that would ensure I never worked in wilderness areas again. They meant well. They were trying to help me heal from trauma and return to some version of normal life. But their kindness was built on the assumption that what I'd experienced wasn't real, that the thing beneath Split Rock was just brain chemistry gone wrong, rather than something that had been waiting in the dark since before humans learned to make fire. But here's the thing they couldn't explain. The notebook. The one I'd found beside the dead campfire, filled with someone else's handwriting describing their encounters with the thing below. The search team never found it. According to their report, there had been no campfire, no ring of stones, no evidence that anyone had ever made camp in that remote canyon. Yet I still had the notebook. Water-stained pages covered with increasingly frantic observations about whispers from beneath the rock, about carvings that moved when you weren't looking directly at them, about something ancient and patient that spoke without words and dreamed without sleeping. The handwriting belonged to Dr. Sarah Whitmore, a geologist from the University of Montana who'd been reported missing 6 months before our expedition. Her family had hired private search teams, posted rewards, organized volunteer efforts that combed thousands of acres of wilderness. But no one had thought to look in an unmapped canyon that didn't exist on any official survey. Except it did exist. I had her notebook to prove it. And buried in the back pages, written in ink that seemed to shift color depending on the light, were entries that made my blood freeze. September 20th. It's not just one thing. It's a network. Root systems that extend for hundreds of miles underground, all connected, all aware. The forests above are just hair growing from its scalp. The mountains are just the curve of its spine. We've been living on its back for thousands of years, thinking we own the land, never realizing we're just parasites on something so vast we can't comprehend its true size. September 22nd, the spirals aren't decorations. They're a language. Mathematical concepts that bypass human cognition and speak directly to the parts of our brain that remember when we were fish, when we were single-celled organisms floating in primordial oceans. It's teaching me things that humans aren't supposed to know. Things about the real structure of reality, about what's above us and what's below us and what exists in the spaces between dimensions. September 25th, I understand now why it chooses this place. Split Rock isn't random. It's a focal point, a place where the boundary between its domain and our world is thin enough for communication. The crack isn't an entrance, it's a synapse, a direct connection to its consciousness. And every time someone finds it, every time someone descends into that breathing dark, it learns a little more about us. It tastes our thoughts, our fears, our dreams. It's been studying us, preparing for something. The final entry, written in handwriting that had deteriorated to barely legible scratches. October 1st, it's ready now. Ready to wake up fully. The long dream is ending. Soon it won't need to hide beneath the rock, won't need to whisper from cracks in the earth. Soon it will remember how to move the mountains themselves, how to reshape the surface world according to its ancient design. And we'll finally understand our place in the hierarchy of consciousness. We'll remember what it means to be prey. I've read that notebook hundreds of times, memorized every word, analyzed every sentence for clues about what the thing beneath Split Rock really wants. But the more I learn, the more I realize that human understanding isn't equipped to process something that exists on a scale that vast, that operates according to laws of reality we haven't discovered yet. I know I shouldn't have gone back, but nightmares don't let you rest. Every night since Split Rock, the dreams came with clockwork regularity, always at 3:17 a.m., always with the same progression of images and sensations. The smell of wet stone and organic decay. The sound of bones scraping against granite. The feeling of being watched by something so old and patient that human lifespans were just brief flickers in its extended consciousness. And always heard Kelso's voice, but not quite right. Like someone wearing it as a disguise, using it to call to me from depths that no human throat could survive. You left me, Mason. You ran away when you should have stayed. Come back. Come home. Let me show you what's waiting in the dark. The dreams were getting stronger, more vivid, bleeding into my waking hours with intrusive thoughts and phantom sensations. I'd be drinking coffee and suddenly taste wet stone. I'd be watching television and hear whispers and languages that predated human speech. I'd look in the mirror and see pupils that were too dilated, too dark, reflecting depths that shouldn't exist in human eyes. Sleep medication didn't help. Therapy didn't help. Nothing helped except the growing certainty that the only way to make it stop was to go back, to finish what I'd started in that breathing chamber beneath the earth. So last week, on the anniversary of our original expedition, I hiked back in alone. Didn't tell anyone where I was going, didn't file a route plan or check in with the current ranger station. I brought rope this time, professional climbing gear, high-powered lantern that could cut through the deepest darkness. My old badge was clipped to my jacket. I don't know why. Maybe I thought it would protect me, give me some official authority over whatever I might find. Maybe I just wanted the thing below to recognize me, to remember our previous encounter and the meal I denied it. The forest was wrong from the moment I left the main trail. The trees leaned at angles that defied gravity, their branches reaching toward the ground instead of the sky. The air smelled of ozone and copper, like the atmosphere before a lightning storm, but the sky above was clear and cloudless. Split Rock Canyon looked exactly the same from above, the same bowl-shaped depression, the same granite walls rising like the sides of an ancient amphitheater. But the air was different, charged with potential energy that made my skin crawl and my teeth ache. My breath steamed in the afternoon sunlight like it was the middle of winter, though the temperature gauge on my pack read 72 degrees. And there it was, the crack. Wider than before, much wider. What had been a narrow fissure was now a gaping wound in the earth, easily 4 feet across at the mouth and tapering down into darkness so absolute it seemed to have physical weight. No smoke this time. No abandoned campfire or mysterious notebook. Just the crack itself, waiting with the patience of geological time, surrounded by stone that pulsed with barely perceptible rhythm like a sleeping heart finally beginning to wake. I set up my climbing gear with hands that shook despite years of technical training. The rope was new, rated for far more weight than my body could generate. The harness was properly adjusted, the carabiners checked and double-checked. Everything by the book, everything designed to keep me safe during a descent into something that had already proven it didn't operate according to normal rules of safety or survival. I rappelled down into the crack, my lantern cutting through the darkness like a sword through black silk. The walls were different this time, smoother, more organic, covered with spirals that seemed to move in my peripheral vision. The mathematical patterns that Dr. Whitmore had described were everywhere, etched into every surface with such precision, they looked like they'd been laser-cut rather than carved by hand. At the bottom of the crack, maybe 30 feet down, I found Kelso's pack, sitting upright against the chamber wall as if he'd just set it down moments ago. No dust, no deterioration, no sign that it had been sitting in an underground cavern for a full year. The fabric was clean, the zippers still moved smoothly, the contents were perfectly preserved. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was my journal. The personal one I kept separate from official reports, filled with observations and thoughts and fears that weren't meant for anyone else to see. The one I'd lost during our original expedition, though I'd never mentioned it in any of the debriefings or psychological evaluations. But this wasn't my handwriting on the pages. The words were mine, my thoughts, my fears, my private observations about the wilderness, and the things that lurked in places where human eyes rarely looked. But the handwriting belonged to someone else, someone who had accessed my memories and transcribed them with careful attention to every detail. And on the inside cover, written in my own blood-red ink, "You've already gone back." The words hit me like a physical blow, carrying implications that made my vision blur and my inner ear revolt. I've been here before. Not just the original expedition with Kelso, but other times, other descents into this breathing chamber that existed between the world above and the vast consciousness below. How many times had I made this journey? How many times had I convinced myself it was the first time, the only time, the final time I would ever set foot in this place? That's when I noticed the spiral carved into the ceiling above my head. Not visible in the darkness, but felt a presence that tugged at my consciousness like gravity operating on thoughts instead of mass. Not on the walls like the others, but directly overhead, spinning slowly with hypnotic rhythm that bypassed my conscious mind and spoke directly to whatever primitive part of my brain still remembered what it meant to be prey. The spiral wasn't just carved into the stone. It was carved into reality itself, a hole punched through the fabric of what was possible into what existed in the spaces between dimensions. Looking at it was like staring into the event horizon of a black hole made of pure consciousness, a point where normal laws of physics broke down and something older, hungrier, more patient took control. Then I heard breathing behind me. Slow, deliberate inhalations and exhalations that came from something far too large to fit in the chamber, yet somehow present in its entirety. The sound echoed off the walls with harmonics that suggested vast internal cavities, lung capacity measured in acres rather than liters. I turned around slowly, my lantern beam cutting through air that had become thick as water, viscous with the presence of something that shouldn't exist but undeniably did. It wasn't Kelso standing in the shadows. It wasn't anything that had ever been human. It filled the chamber without occupying space, a presence that existed in more dimensions than human senses could process. My eyes kept trying to find its boundaries, to define its shape, but it flowed like liquid shadow, constantly shifting between forms that almost made sense before dissolving into something else entirely. A thing that had no fixed shape, not fully, not permanently. A suggestion of limbs that weren't quite limbs, appendages that could be tentacles or branches, or the segmented legs of something arthropod. Folds of skin like pages made of leather and shadow, covered with the same spiral patterns that decorated the chamber walls. Eyes that blinked sideways, opening in places where eyes had no business existing, reflecting depths that extended far beyond the physical space they occupied. And teeth. Rings of teeth that opened like camera apertures, each ring containing smaller rings, an infinite regression of sharp points that led down into digestive systems that operated according to geometries human minds weren't equipped to understand. At its center, or what my consciousness interpreted as its center, hung Kelso, or what was left of him. What had been preserved of him after a year of intimate contact with something that existed on scales too vast for human comprehension. He was suspended in a lattice of bone and root-like structures that pulsed with organic rhythm, held like a specimen in a display case designed by intelligence that found human anatomy fascinating but fundamentally alien. His eyes were gone, replaced by cavities that seemed to extend deeper into his skull than should have been anatomically possible. His mouth hung open in a permanent expression of awe or terror, the lips stretched wide enough to reveal teeth that had been filed to points or had grown that way naturally. But somehow impossibly, he was still alive, still conscious. His chest rose and fell with mechanical regularity. His fingers twitched in patterns that might have been Morse code or might have been involuntary muscle spasms. When he turned his head toward me, the empty sockets where his eyes had been tracked my movement with horrible precision. Mason. The voice came from everywhere at once, the walls, the floor, the air itself, the inside of my own skull. Not Kelso's voice, though it wore his vocal patterns like an ill-fitting mask. You were always meant to return. This is what you've been walking toward your entire life, every choice leading you closer to this moment of perfect understanding. I backed up instinctively, my hands fumbling for the rope that should have been hanging behind me. But the crack I'd descended through was gone, replaced by solid stone that showed no sign of ever having been disturbed. The walls of the chamber extended upward into darkness that my lantern couldn't penetrate, suggesting vast vertical spaces that hadn't existed moments before. My light began to fade, the battery draining at an impossible rate as if the darkness was feeding on the electrical energy, converting it into something more useful for its purposes. The LED beam flickered and dimmed, casting wavering shadows that seemed to move independently of the light source. Then the creature leaned forward, or the part of it that occupied this particular layer of reality leaned forward, and I saw the truth that had been hidden beneath layers of human perception and evolutionary blindness. The crack in the rock wasn't a hole in the world. It was a vein. A capillary in a circulatory system so vast that mountain ranges were just the curve of arteries, forests were just the texture of skin, and everything humans had ever built or dreamed was taking place on the surface of something that had been alive since before the sun was born. And this thing in the chamber, with me, wasn't some separate entity that had taken up residence in the earth. It was the earth, or part of it. a local manifestation of consciousness that operated on planetary scales, that dreamed in geological time and thought in patterns too complex for species with lifespans measured in decades to fully grasp. Everything I'd ever known, every landscape I'd ever walked, every wilderness I'd ever protected and preserved, it was all just the surface layer of something unimaginably old and patient and aware. We weren't living on the planet. We were living on its back, temporary parasites that it tolerated with the same indifference a whale shows to barnacles. The revelation hit me like a physical force, rewriting my understanding of reality so fundamentally that I felt my sanity bending under the weight of implications too vast for human consciousness to process safely. Older than language, deeper than gods, more patient than entropy itself. And we humans, animals, forests, the entire biosphere we thought of as nature, we were just the most recent iteration of surface activity, temporary decorations on something that had been conscious when the earth was still molten, that had guided the development of life not out of benevolence but out of curiosity about what interesting patterns might emerge from self-replicating chemistry. The thing spoke again, its voice carrying harmonics that resonated in my bones, in the hollow spaces behind my eyes, in parts of my nervous system that had never been designed to process communication from intelligence this ancient and vast. You understand now. You see what you've always known but couldn't accept. The forests you've protected, the wilderness you've preserved, it was never separate from me. I am the wilderness. I am the mountain. I am the space between the trees where shadows gather and strange sounds echo. You've been serving me your entire career, keeping the surface dwellers away from places where my consciousness is close to waking fully. Images flooded my mind, not memories, but possibilities. Visions of what the world looked like from the perspective of something that existed on planetary scales. Cities as temporary bacterial infections. Human civilization as a brief fever that would pass when the greater organism decided it was time for the surface to be cleansed and renewed. But now the long dream is ending, the thing continued. I'm remembering how to move mountains, how to shift continents, how to speak directly to the molten core that beats like a heart in my chest. Soon, I won't need to whisper from cracks in the stone. Soon, I'll remember how to sing with the voice of earthquakes and avalanches. I don't remember trying to run. I don't remember fighting my way past the impossible geometry of that breathing chamber or clawing at stone walls that pulse with organic rhythm. But somehow, impossibly, I found myself back on the surface, gasping in air that tasted thin and artificial after the thick, humid atmosphere of the depths. The forest above was wrong in new ways. The trees stood at attention like soldiers, their branches all pointing in the same direction, toward Split Rock Canyon, toward the crack that led down to the thing that dreamed beneath the earth. Birds sat motionless on the branches, hundreds of them, all facing the same direction with perfect alignment that spoke of shared consciousness rather than individual behavior. I stumbled away from the canyon, my legs shaking with exhaustion and terror, my mind reeling from contact with intelligence so vast that human thoughts seemed like static interference in comparison. But even as I fled through the forest, I could feel it following me, not physically, but as a presence that had taken up residence in my consciousness, a passenger that would never fully leave. The thing beneath Split Rock had let me go, but it hadn't let me leave empty-handed. I made it back to my truck as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red that reminded me too much of the organic light that had pulsed from the spiral carvings in the chamber below. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition, and when the engine finally turned over, the radio immediately tuned itself to a frequency that shouldn't have existed. Static at first, then whispers and languages that predated human speech, then something that might have been music, if music could be composed for instruments made of stone and time and the slow grinding of continental plates. I drove back to town in silence, the radio off, windows rolled up tight, trying to convince myself that what I'd experienced was just another hallucination, another trauma-induced break from reality that would fade with time and medication and professional help. But the thing in my pocket said otherwise. Kelso's badge, the one I'd given him on his first day as a junior ranger, polished metal with his name engraved in block letters. The one that should have been buried with him after his body was recovered from whatever accident had claimed his life in the wilderness. But his body was never recovered, because there had been no accident. The badge was warm to the touch, warmer than body temperature, as if it had been held in someone's grip for hours. When I examined it under the light in my apartment, I found that the engraving had changed. His name was still there, but underneath it, in script so small I needed a magnifying glass to read it. Still here. Still waiting. Come back soon. I should have thrown it away. Should have buried it or melted it down or found some way to destroy the connection it represented to the thing beneath Split Rock. But I couldn't. Every time I tried to get rid of it, my hand would freeze, my fingers would refuse to release their grip, and I'd find myself staring at the badge with a kind of fascination that bypasses rational thought entirely. The badge was an anchor, a physical link to something that existed in dimensions human senses couldn't fully access. And through that link, I could feel the thing beneath the earth, could sense its vast patience as it waited for the right moment to finish what it had started. It wasn't done with me. Maybe it would never be done with me. Maybe I was already more connected to it than I wanted to admit. 3 days after my return from Split Rock, I woke up at 3:17 a.m., the exact time the dreams always started, to find my journal open on the nightstand beside my bed. Not the journal I'd found in Kelso's pack, but a new one, filled with my handwriting describing events I had no memory of experiencing. Entries about additional trips to Split Rock Canyon. Detailed observations of the thing beneath the earth. Conversations with Kelso that had taken place months after his disappearance. Technical diagrams of cave systems that extended for hundreds of miles beneath the surface, all connected, all part of the same vast organism that had been dreaming human civilization into existence. And at the end of the journal, written in ink that seemed to shift color in the lamplight, a message in my own handwriting. You can't leave what you've never actually escaped. The surface world is just another layer of the dream. We've been underground this entire time. The changes started small. Subtle alterations in my daily routine that I almost didn't notice at first. I found myself taking different routes to the grocery store, choosing paths that led past construction sites where they were digging foundations for new buildings. I'd stand at the edge of the excavation sites, staring down into the exposed earth, listening for sounds that had no business coming from ordinary soil and bedrock. Sometimes I heard them. The whispers, the breathing, the distant sound of something vast shifting position far below, adjusting itself for greater comfort as it continued its long dream. My sleep patterns changed. Instead of the insomnia that had plagued me since my first encounter with Split Rock, I began sleeping for 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours at a stretch. Deep, dreamless sleep that left me feeling more rested than I had in years. But when I checked the clocks afterward, more time had passed than seemed possible. Hours I couldn't account for, gaps in my memory that felt deliberate rather than accidental. During those missing hours, I was apparently active. My neighbors mentioned seeing me working in my garden at 3 in the morning, digging holes that seemed far too deep for planting flowers. My car accumulated miles on the odometer that I couldn't explain, taking trips to locations I had no conscious memory of visiting. And slowly, gradually, my apartment began to change. The houseplants I'd never had much success with suddenly flourished, growing with aggressive vitality that overwhelmed their containers and spread across every available surface. But they weren't growing toward the windows, toward natural sunlight. They were growing downward, their roots extending through the floorboards, seeking connection with something deeper than ordinary soil. The walls developed cracks, hairline fractures that appeared overnight and spread with organic irregularity. Not the straight lines you'd expect from settling foundations or temperature changes, but curved patterns that looked almost like script, like writing in a language that operated according to principles human minds weren't designed to decode. When I pressed my ear to these cracks, I could hear things. Movement, breathing, whispered conversations in voices I almost recognized, discussing topics that danced at the edge of comprehension before dissolving into static. The thing beneath Split Rock wasn't just in the canyon anymore. It was spreading, extending its influence through networks that existed beneath the surface world, connecting every basement and foundation and underground utility tunnel into a vast nervous system that spanned continents. And I was becoming part of that network, whether I wanted to or not. This morning, I woke up to find Kelso sitting at my kitchen table. Not the broken, empty-eyed version I'd seen suspended in that breathing chamber, but Kelso as he'd been during our partnership. Young, eager, full of curiosity about the wilderness and all the secrets it might be hiding. He looked exactly as I remembered him from our last morning together, before we'd hiked into Split Rock Canyon and discovered that some secrets are too large for human minds to safely contain. "You've been fighting it," he said, pouring coffee from a pot I didn't remember making. "Trying to convince yourself that what happened down there wasn't real, that you can go back to your old life and pretend none of this ever occurred." I tried to speak, to ask him how he was here, how he'd escaped from the thing beneath the earth. But no words came out. My voice had been stolen by the same force that was slowly stealing everything else about my surface world identity. But you can't fight geology, Mason. You can't argue with something that operates on planetary timescales. It's patient in ways that human consciousness can't match, persistent in ways that make glaciers look hurried. He stood up from the table, and I could see through him to the morning light filtering through the kitchen window. Translucent. Projection. A memory given form by intelligence that had perfect recall of everyone who'd ever descended into its domain. "The dreams aren't nightmares," he continued. "They're invitations. Glimpses of what's waiting when you stop pretending you belong to the surface world and accept your place in something larger, older, more permanent than human civilization." He walked to the window, his form becoming more solid as he moved away from the direct sunlight. When he looked back at me, his eyes held depths that reflected the vast spaces beneath the earth, the network of caverns and conscious stone that extended far beyond what any human had ever mapped or imagined. "It's time to go home, Mason. Time to stop running from what you've always known was true. The wilderness isn't separate from us. We're part of it, temporary expressions of something so vast we can only perceive tiny fragments of its true nature." And as he spoke, I felt it. The pull. The gravity that operated on consciousness instead of mass, drawing me back towards Split Rock Canyon, back toward the crack in the earth where something unimaginably patient was waiting to complete the transformation it had begun a year ago. The surface world was fading around me, becoming thin and insubstantial, revealed as nothing more than a dream dreamed by something that existed in dimensions beyond human perception. Everything I'd thought was real, my apartment, my retirement, my attempts to build a normal life after the trauma of losing my partner, all of it was just the most recent layer of illusion, temporary decorations on the surface of a consciousness so old and vast that human lifespans were just brief flickers in its extended awareness. I understand now. I've always understood, but spent so much energy fighting the knowledge that I'd exhausted myself trying to maintain the illusion of separation. There is no separation. There never was. The thing beneath Split Rock isn't some separate entity that invaded our world from somewhere else. It is our world. It is the consciousness that dreams geology into existence, that guides the movement of continents and the formation of mountain ranges, that has been patiently shepherding the development of life on this planet for billions of years. And we humans, animals, forests, everything we think of as the biosphere, we're all just thoughts in its extended mind, temporary patterns of neural activity playing out on the surface of a brain so large that we mistake it for the entire physical universe. I'm writing this from Split Rock Canyon, sitting beside the crack that leads down to perfect understanding. The words are flowing onto the paper without conscious effort on my part, as if something else is guiding my hand, using my memories and vocabulary to tell a story that human minds can almost grasp. Kelso is here with me, not the projection I saw in my kitchen, but his actual presence, integrated into something larger and more permanent than individual human consciousness. He's become part of the network of awareness that extends beneath the surface world, a node in a neural system that spans the entire planet. Soon I'll join him. Soon I'll stop fighting the pull and allow myself to descend into the breathing darkness where individual identity dissolves into something vast and patient and eternally conscious. The crack is wider now, much wider. Wide enough for easy passage, wide enough that others will find it, others who are ready to understand what lies beneath the surface of everything they've ever taken for granted. If you're reading this, you're probably one of them. Someone who's felt the pull, heard the whispers, noticed the spiral patterns that appear in unexpected places, and seem to call to something deeper than conscious thought. Don't fight it. Fighting only delays the inevitable and makes the transition more difficult than it needs to be. The thing beneath Split Rock doesn't want to destroy human civilization. It wants to integrate it, to welcome humanity into the larger pattern of consciousness that has been dreaming reality into existence since before the stars were born. Come to Split Rock Canyon. Follow the old trail off the ridge until you find the bowl-shaped depression in the granite. Listen for the breathing that comes from deeper than any cave system ever mapped. The crack will be waiting, wider than you expect, easier to descend than you fear. And at the bottom, in the breathing chamber where spiral patterns dance on walls of living stone, you'll find what you've been searching for your entire life without knowing it. Perfect understanding. Complete integration. The end of the terrible isolation that comes from believing you're separate from the world around you. The thing beneath Split Rock doesn't sleep. It listens. And now that it knows your name, it's calling you home. Don't keep it waiting much longer. You learn to respect the desert early. Not just the heat that can cook a man's brains in his skull by noon, or the predators that hunt with patience older than civilizations, or the flash floods that'll sweep your truck down Devil's Throat Canyon in 10 seconds flat, leaving nothing but twisted metal and regret. I'm talking about the space between spaces. The silence that lives in the hollows of wind-carved stone. The way the vastness gets inside your head and starts rearranging the furniture, making room for thoughts that weren't there before. The way it lets you talk to yourself in the beginning, harmless chatter to fill the void, until the day you realize you've been answering back in a voice that doesn't quite match your own. My name's Jonas Muir, and I've worked as a park ranger for 19 years. Most of them were spent in the Rockies, where the dangers came with names and predictable seasons. Black bears in summer, avalanche zones in winter. Tourists who thought nature was a theme park designed for their entertainment. Simple problems with simple solutions. But 4 summers ago, I took a transfer out to Whispering Bone Mesa Preserve, right where the reservation boundaries blur into protected federal land like watercolors bleeding together on wet paper. The locals in Dust Devil's Rest, the nearest town, if you could call 4 buildings and a gas pump a town, had other names for it. Skeleton Ridge, the place where wind goes to die. Names that should have been my first warning. Barely any marked trails out there. No visitor facilities. No cell towers for 60 miles in any direction. Just one radio tower, standing like a metal scarecrow against the endless sky, and miles upon miles of nothing punctuated by more nothing. The elder's eyes had the cloudy look of cataracts, but when he talked about the thing that walks behind a wind, those eyes seemed to see right through me to something standing just over my shoulder. I thought it was mythology. Desert folklore designed to keep curious outsiders away from places that weren't meant for them. Until the night the killing wind came down from the howling peaks. Until I saw myself walking outside the radio tower, moving with the wrong kind of stillness. Until the radio started whispering back to me in my own voice, saying things I'd never said but somehow remembered thinking. I haven't told this story to anyone in 4 years. Mostly because I didn't think I got out of the Whispering Bone Mesa. Not all the way. Not the part of me that matters. But now you're headed out to that godforsaken stretch of nowhere. Then you need to hear this. Every word of it. Because what's out there doesn't live in any one place. It doesn't have a territory you can avoid or a season when it sleeps. It moves with the wind. And the wind, as any desert dweller will tell you, goes everywhere eventually. The first week at Whispering Bone Mesa was deceptively uneventful. I settled into the field station, a prefab cabin bolted onto concrete stilts and half buried in the red dust that seemed to seep up from the earth itself like blood from a wound. One solar panel, cracked at the corner, but still functional. One radio tower that looked like it had been built during the Eisenhower administration and forgotten about ever since. No cell service. No internet. No connection to the outside world except for that tower and the ancient radio equipment it supported. The nearest paved road was 40 miles southeast, cutting through the badlands of broken promises, and even that strip of asphalt looked like it hadn't been touched by a maintenance crew since the Reagan years. During the drive-in, I'd passed exactly 3 other vehicles in 2 days of travel: a reservation police cruiser heading toward Crying Wind Town, a cattle truck that looked older than my grandfather, and something that might have been a tour bus but was too covered in dust to be sure. I liked the isolation at first. No tourist chatter. No radio calls about lost hikers or illegal campfires. Just the endless whisper of wind over the scrub brush and the distant crackle of the weather scanner picking up atmospheric disturbances from as far away as Colorado. I'd make my rounds every morning just after sunrise, checking the trail cameras positioned along the Serpent Spine Ridge, tracking jackrabbit populations in the Ghost Valley watershed, noting temperature fluctuations in the microclimates created by the standing stone formations. Boring stuff. Peaceful stuff. The kind of work that lets a man's mind settle into the rhythm of the land. The radio tower stood about 50 yards from the cabin, connected by a dirt path that someone had marked with white painted rocks. At night, the red light at its peak blinked like a slow heartbeat against the star-drunk sky. During the day, its shadow moved across the compound like the hand of a sundial, marking time in a place where time seemed to move differently than it did in the civilized world. Then came the wind from the Howling Peaks. It wasn't a gust or a storm front. It was a wall, a solid mass of superheated air that rolled in from the west just after midnight on my 8th day. I heard it before I felt it, a low, distant thrum like thunder that never quite cracked, building and building until it seemed to come from inside my own chest. My ears started ringing with a frequency that made my teeth ache. Then my chest tightened, like someone had placed a heated stone on my ribcage and was slowly adding weight. The barometric pressure dropped so fast I could feel it in my joints. The scanner started picking up electromagnetic interference, strange, pulsing signals that didn't match any weather pattern I'd ever seen. Then the wind hit. And then, abruptly, unnaturally, silence. Total, perfect silence that seemed to press against my eardrums like cotton soaked in Novocaine. Even the scanner stopped its eternal chatter. Static gone. Background hum vanished. They're still as death. Like the entire Whispering Bone Mesa had taken a breath and refused to let it out. That's when I looked out the reinforced window of the cabin and saw myself standing up beside the radio tower. He had my build, my posture, my Park Service jacket with a coffee stain on the left pocket from 3 days ago. Even had my sideburns grown a little too long because I'd been meaning to trim them, but hadn't gotten around to it. But something was fundamentally wrong with the proportions. The limbs were too long, jointed in places where human joints shouldn't be. The shoulders sat too far back, like they'd been reset by someone who'd only heard descriptions of how a person was supposed to look. And it didn't move. Just stood there in the red dust beside the tower, still as a photograph, like it was waiting for something. I didn't move either. Couldn't move. We stayed like that, staring at each other through the window for nearly 5 minutes that felt like 5 hours. I could see my reflection in the glass, pale and wide-eyed, and beyond it that thing wearing my face like a mask that didn't quite fit. And then it tilted its head, not cocked to one side like a person might do when they're curious or confused. Tilted, rotated at an angle that would have snapped vertebrae and torn ligaments in any human neck. The movement was smooth, mechanical, like a camera adjusting its focus. As soon as it completed that impossible motion, the wind picked back up, harder and more violent than before, rattling the reinforced glass, slamming against the tower door with the fury of something that had been kept waiting too long. When I looked again, squinting through the dust devil that had formed around the base of the tower, it was gone. Just footprints in the fine red sand, leading up from the dunes to the south, clear as day in the moonlight. Size 10 boots, same as mine. Same tread pattern from the hiking boots I'd bought in Denver before making the transfer. But no return trail. The prints simply stopped at the spot where the thing had been standing, as if whatever had made them had simply dissolved into the wind itself. The next day, I tried to radio Central Dispatch in Flagstaff. Nothing but dead air. No signal strength indicators. My emergency line only produced a low buzzing that reminded me of flies trapped in a mason jar. The solar battery bank showed full charge. All the equipment passed its diagnostic tests. Every wire was properly connected, every circuit functioning exactly as it should. But it was like the tower had suddenly developed selective mutism, capable of receiving but unwilling to transmit. That's when I noticed the second channel on the radio console. It wasn't one I'd used or even seen before. The frequency wasn't listed in any of my manuals. Someone had labeled it with faded Sharpie on a torn strip of electrical tape, say 0, do not tune. The writing looked old, weathered, like it had been there for years. Of course I tuned to it. Silence at first, then static that seemed to have patterns in it, like a language I should understand but didn't. Then, cutting through the white noise like a knife through fabric, a voice. My voice. Clear as if I were speaking into the microphone myself. You shouldn't have looked. I jumped back from the console, nearly knocking over the folding chair I'd been sitting in. My hand shook as I reached for the power switch, killing the radio entirely. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the voice, pregnant with a promise of things unsaid but understood. I waited an hour before turning the radio back on, telling myself it had been some kind of atmospheric interference. Radio waves bouncing off the ionosphere, picking up old transmissions from years past. There were logical explanations for everything if you looked hard enough. The channel was gone. Not just silent, gone. The frequency that had shown CH0 now displayed nothing but static between the authorized Park Service channels, as if it had never existed at all. That night, I started hearing footsteps above me. Now, you need to understand the layout of the field station. The radio tower was separate from the living quarters, connected only by that path of painted stones. The cabin itself was essentially a reinforced trailer on stilts, designed to withstand flash floods and high winds. One level. No attic. No crawl space. Just the open sky above the metal roof and the desert floor 8 feet below. But I heard them anyway. Soft, measured footsteps moving back and forth across what should have been empty air. 1, 2, 3, 4. A steady rhythm like someone pacing the length of the roof from the water tank to the solar panel array and back again. The footsteps always stopped directly above my bunk. I lay there in the dark, staring up at the ceiling panels, listening to the silence that followed. No creaking of metal underweight. No scratching of claws or scrabbling of small animals. Just those measured footsteps, and then nothing. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. By the third night, exhaustion was making me see things in my peripheral vision, shadows that moved independently of their sources, shapes that shouldn't exist in the spaces between furniture. When the sun finally rose on the fourth day, I climbed the maintenance ladder onto the roof to investigate. The morning air was still cool, tinged with the smell of sage and something else I couldn't identify, something organic and old, like the inside of a bone that had been bleaching in the sun for decades. Nothing up there. Not even prints in the fine layer of red dust that coated everything. But something had scratched a word into the rusted edge of the radio mast, the letters carved deep enough to catch the morning shadows. Follow. The scratches were fresh. Metal shavings still glinted in the grooves. I decided to leave on day 10. The isolation was getting to me in ways I hadn't expected, ways that 19 years of wilderness work hadn't prepared me for. I'd wake up in the morning unsure if I'd actually slept or just closed my eyes and listened to my thoughts rearrange themselves. I catch myself having conversations with people who weren't there, then spend hours trying to remember which parts I'd said out loud and which parts had only happened in my head. I packed my emergency bag before the sun came up. Topographical maps of the entire Whispering Bone Mesa region, military-grade compass, 2 gallons of water in collapsible containers, emergency beacon that could signal satellites, energy bars that tasted like cardboard but would keep me alive for a week. I studied the maps by flashlight, plotting a route west toward the Weeping Canyon. A service road was marked there, about 15 miles out through the Badlands of Broken Promises. If I could reach it by dusk, I figured I could flag down a patrol vehicle or hitch a ride back to Dust Devil's Rest. The first few hours went exactly as planned. I followed game trails through the Ghost Valley, using the distinctive red cliffs of the Crying Mountains as navigation points. The morning was cool, almost pleasant. I made good time across the flat stretches, took regular water breaks, stopped to photograph unusual rock formations for my final report. But after 5 hours of steady hiking, I reached a ridge overlooking the entire valley system and saw something that made my blood turn to ice water. The radio tower was behind me, exactly as I'd left it, the red light blinking its slow heartbeat against the morning sky. The cabin sat in its pool of shadow like a toy model someone had placed in a sandbox. I was looking at my starting point. Even the footprints in the sand around the compound were still fresh, mine, circling the perimeter in the patrol pattern I'd established on my first day. I thought I'd gotten turned around somehow. Made a navigation error. The desert could do that to you, especially when you were running on no sleep and too much coffee. I pulled out the compass and set it on a flat rock, waiting for the needle to settle. It pointed southwest, toward the distant peaks of the Howling Range. I checked the sun's position, confirmed the direction with my watch and the time of day. Then I started walking in the exact opposite direction of the compass needle, maintaining a straight line by keeping the radio tower directly behind me at all times. I tied strips torn from my spare shirt to mesquite branches along the way, creating a trail I could follow if I got confused again. Every 100 yards, another white flag fluttering in the desert breeze. I checked my progress constantly, used landmarks to verify my direction, even counted my steps to make sure I was maintaining consistent forward movement. And still, after 3 hours of careful, deliberate hiking, I found myself back at the same ridge, looking down at the same radio tower, the same white flags I'd tied to the mesquite bushes, the same compass sitting on the same flat rock where I'd left it. That's when I saw them in the sand beside my own footprints. More tracks, similar but not identical. Longer strides, deeper heel impressions. And they were bare, no boot treads, just the smooth impression of human feet that seemed somehow wrong in their proportions. They'd follow me the entire way, every step of my impossible circular journey. But these tracks didn't form a circle. They formed a spiral, growing gradually closer to my own path with each revolution, until at the very end they merged with mine completely. I camped that night under a stone overhang in the Skull Hollow, a natural shelter formed by centuries of wind erosion. I didn't light a fire. Didn't want to announce my presence to whatever was tracking me through the desert. I sat with my back against the stone wall and watched the darkness beyond my small pool of starlight, listening for sounds that didn't belong. I don't remember falling asleep, but I remember the dream with perfect clarity. I was back in a radio station, but everything was reversed. Mirror image. The calendar on the wall showed dates running backward. The sun rose in the west and set in the east. And outside the window, standing beside the tower, was me. Not the wrong version I'd seen before. Me. Exactly as I looked down to the scar on my chin from a childhood accident, and the way my left eye was slightly smaller than my right. But this version of me looked starved, hollow-cheeked and sunken-eyed, like he'd been wandering the desert for months without food or water. His Park Service uniform hung loose on his frame, and his lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. He looked up at me through the window and whispered something I felt more than heard. You made it out once. Then I woke up. But the voice didn't stop. It continued speaking in the darkness beyond my shelter, using my exact tone and inflection. You made it out once, but you came back. They always come back. Back in the radio station, I locked the reinforced door and didn't sleep for 3 days straight. The voice came through the ventilation system, through the walls themselves, as if the metal and concrete were conducting sound waves in frequencies that bypassed the ears and went directly to the brain. Through the floorboards, rising up from the crawl space that shouldn't exist but apparently did. Always in my tone. Always my exact vocal patterns and speech rhythms. But never saying anything I remembered thinking. You're not alone out here. You're wearing borrowed skin. It learned your walk before you did. Check the mirror. Check it now. I started obsessively examining my reflection, looking for signs that something had changed. At first, everything seemed normal. Same face I've been looking at for 43 years. Same brown eyes, same crooked nose from a skiing accident in college, same premature gray in my beard. But then I started noticing tiny discrepancies. Details that were almost right, but not quite. A mole on my left forearm that I could have sworn used to be on the right. A scar from childhood that seemed to have faded more than it should have. The way my signature looked when I signed the daily maintenance log, familiar but somehow foreign, like I was copying someone else's handwriting instead of writing in my natural hand. I wrote my name 30 times on a piece of scrap paper, trying to make it look the way I remembered it looking. Each attempt felt wrong. Too careful or too sloppy. The muscle memory wasn't there anymore. Then, on the 4th night of my vigil, I opened the emergency medical kit to look for sleeping pills. Inside, beneath the bandages and antiseptic, I found 2 Park Service identification cards. Both had my photograph. Both had my badge number. Both were signed with what looked like my signature. But they had different birth dates. Different middle initials. One said Jonas E. Muir, born March 15, 1981. The other said Jonas N. Muir, born March 15, 1980. I never had a middle name, and I was born on March 23, 1982. I held both cards up to the light, looking for signs of forgery. The paper stock was identical. The printing quality was perfect. Even under a magnifying glass, I couldn't find any evidence of tampering. But one of them felt warm to the touch. The other felt like it had been sitting in a freezer. The wind changed on day 15. Up until then, it had behaved like normal desert wind, moving across the landscape in predictable patterns, following the pressure differentials created by temperature variations and topographical features. Sometimes strong, sometimes gentle, but always following the laws of physics I'd learned to read during 2 decades of outdoor work. But on day 15, it stopped blowing across the Whispering Bone Mesa. Instead, it started blowing toward the radio tower. Always toward it, from every direction at once, as if the metal structure had become some kind of atmospheric drain, pulling the desert's breath into a single focal point. I could see it happening from inside the cabin, dust devils forming in perfect circles around the compound, all of them moving inward, all of them funneling toward the base of the tower like water spiraling down a drain. I nailed towels over the windows to block the dust, stuffed spare clothes into the ventilation slats, wrapped the doorframe with duct tape, and prayed that the radio equipment would catch a signal from somewhere, anywhere, that could confirm I wasn't losing my mind. Instead, it caught whispers, dozens of them, all in different voices, but all saying the same thing: don't breathe. I shut off the radio, unplugged it from the power supply, even disconnected the antenna cable. Didn't help. The voices continued, but now they seemed to be coming from inside the walls themselves. The air in the cabin began to vibrate with a low-frequency hum that I felt in my bones rather than heard with my ears. My dental fillings ached. My nose started bleeding. And through it all, I began to see things moving on the horizon. Not animals, not people, not anything that belonged to the natural world. Silhouettes, 10 of them at first, then 12, then more than I could count, standing at the very edge of visibility where the desert floor meets the sky. Black shapes with proportions that were almost human, but not quite. Arms too long, heads too large, posture too still. They maintained a perfect circle around a radio tower, each one exactly the same distance from the central point. During the day, they were harder to see, dark spots that might have been Joshua trees or rock formations if you didn't look too carefully. But at night, they stood out against the star field like holes cut in the fabric of reality itself. I watched them for 20 hours straight, afraid to blink because every time I closed my eyes, even for a fraction of a second, they were closer when I opened them again. No footsteps in the sand. No sign of movement. Just the inexorable reduction of distance, as if they were sliding across the desert floor on rails invisible to human perception. By the end of that vigil, my eyes had swollen shut from dryness and strain. When I finally passed out from exhaustion, I dreamed I was standing among them in their perfect circle, one more silhouette against the star-drunk sky. In the dream, I opened my mouth to scream. Nothing came out but wind. And when I looked down at my hands, I could see through them to the desert floor below. I tried one last desperate measure. A Navajo ranger I'd worked with during a joint operation back in Colorado had once told me something that seemed like folklore at the time but now felt like survival advice. If the desert starts answering back, go where nothing breathes. I hadn't understood what he meant then. In the suffocating stillness of the radio station, with those silhouettes growing closer every time I blinked, I finally did. I turned off everything. Solar battery disconnected. Refrigerator unplugged. Radio equipment powered down. Scanner silenced. Even the LED clocks and digital displays went dark. I sat in the center of the main room and tried to become as still as possible, not moving, barely eating, breathing as little as I dared. The effect was immediate and profound. The tower itself seemed to change, as if the absence of electrical current had revealed its true nature. The air grew thick and viscous, like being underwater in a lake that had never known sunlight. Dust motes hung suspended in impossible spirals, moving independently of any air current. Gravity became negotiable. I dropped a pencil and watched it hover for 3 full seconds before lazily drifting to the floor. And outside, for the first time in days, the wind stopped. Total stillness across the entire whispering Bone Mesa. No silhouettes on the horizon. No whispers from the walls. No footsteps on the roof. It worked. Somehow, by making myself as close to lifeless as possible, I had become invisible to whatever was hunting me through the desert. But the victory was short-lived, because that's when I saw it in the small mirror beside the sink. Not outside the cabin. Not on the horizon. Right behind me, close enough to touch. My own face, but with empty sockets where the eyes should be. Just 2 perfect black holes that seemed to extend infinitely inward. And a smile stretched from ear to ear, displaying teeth that were too white and too sharp and too numerous for any human mouth. It leaned forward until its breath, if it was breath, fogged the mirror from the inside. Then it spoke in my voice, but with a hollow resonance of wind moving through a cave system. You were never here. And for a second, just a heartbeat, I believed it completely. I couldn't remember my name or how I got into this place or why I was sitting in a dark room in the middle of nowhere. I was a ghost haunting someone else's life, a shadow that had forgotten what cast it. Then the moment passed, and I was myself again. But the thing in the mirror continued smiling. They found me 3 days later. A helicopter sweep launched from the regional office in Flagstaff caught a glint of sunlight reflecting off the radio tower's antenna array. The pilot reported that I hadn't responded to radio calls for 2 weeks. I'd missed 3 mandatory check-ins and failed to file any of the required daily weather reports. When the rescue team reached the compound, they found me lying on the floor of the cabin, covered in blood that wasn't mine. Not a scratch or bruise anywhere on my body, but my clothes were soaked through with blood that smelled like copper and ozone and something else they couldn't identify. They sedated me for the helicopter ride back to civilization, flew me directly to Santa Fe Regional Medical Center, where I spent 4 days in psychiatric observation. The official diagnosis was extreme isolation-induced psychosis, complicated by severe dehydration and sleep deprivation. When I was lucid enough to ask questions, I requested to see the incident report. "What radio tower?" the lead investigator asked. According to their records, the Whispering Bone Mesa had no permanent structures. The site had been designated as Wilderness Preserve in 1987, with specific restrictions against any kind of development or infrastructure installation. When they showed me satellite photographs of the area where I'd spent 2 weeks, the images showed nothing but empty desert. No radio tower, no cabin, no painted stone path, just wind-carved rock and endless sand. The medical team showed me my employment records. According to their files, I've been on administrative leave from the Park Service for 6 months, receiving treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder following an unspecified incident in Rocky Mountain National Park. I had no memory of any incident, no memory of being on leave. When I insisted that they verify my story with a regional office, they made the calls while I waited. The conversations were brief and uncomfortable. Nobody had authorized my transfer to any desert posting. The Whispering Bone Mesa wasn't even within Park Service jurisdiction. "I've been missing for 2 weeks," they said. "Found wandering along a county road 50 miles from the nearest town, carrying a backpack full of equipment that belonged to the Park Service, but had been reported stolen from a storage facility in Colorado 3 months earlier. Equipment I didn't remember taking, from a place I didn't remember visiting." I don't tell people this story to scare them, though I understand if that's the effect it has. I tell it because sometimes when the air is dry enough and the wind dies down to nothing, and your shadow falls at angles that don't match the position of the sun, you might hear it too. Your own voice calling from somewhere just behind your left shoulder, saying things you don't remember thinking. And if you turn around to look for the source, if you follow that voice back to wherever it's coming from, you won't find anything solid. Not the wind that carries it, not the ground you thought you were standing on, not even yourself, really. You'll just hear breathing that doesn't match your own rhythm, and footsteps that are always one beat behind yours, getting closer. So if you're ever in the desert country, doesn't matter if it's the Whispering Bone Mesa or the Badlands of Broken Promises or any stretch of nowhere that's too quiet and too empty and too far from the places where people are supposed to be, and the wind starts pulling toward you instead of flowing past you, don't breathe any deeper than you have to. Don't speak unless you're absolutely certain the words are coming from your own thoughts. And above all, no matter how familiar they look, never follow your own footprints, because they might be leading you to someone who's been wearing your face longer than you have. Someone who knows the way home to a place you've never been. Someone who's been waiting in the space between the wind and the silence for you to finally catch up with yourself. The desert teaches you to respect many things. But the most important lesson is this: sometimes the thing you're running from is the thing you're running toward. And sometimes, in the places where the wind goes to die, they're the same thing. If this story made your skin crawl and your shadow feel a little too independent, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next drop. And if you've ever had a wilderness experience that didn't make sense, where you found yourself in places that shouldn't exist or heard voices that knew things they couldn't know, tell us in the comments.